Section 31 of the Arabian Nights Entertainments, Vol.4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nico Williams. The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Vol.4, translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 31, The Sultan and the Traveler. Story of the First Sharper in the Cave. My father died when I was a youth, leaving my mother and myself with little property, but an old she-goat which we sold, and with the price bought a calf, and nourished her as well as we could for a whole year, when my mother desired me to go and dispose of her in the market. Accordingly I went, and soon perceived that there was not a fatter or finer beast in the market. The company of butchers, composed of 40 persons, fixed their eyes upon the calf, and supposing me an ignorant lad, resolved to have her for little or nothing, and feast themselves upon her flesh. After concerting among themselves, one of them coming up said, "My lad, dost thou mean to sell this she-goat?" "Goat," replied I, "it is a calf." "Nay," answered he, "surely thou must be blind or under enchantment, but old as the goat is, if thou wilt sell it, I will give thee a course for her." I angrily refused, and he went away, when presently up came another, and in short and regular succession the whole 40, the last of whom was the chief of the butchers. I perceived the connivance to cheat me, and resolving to be avenged, said, "I am convinced I am deceived, so you shall have the goat, if such she is, for the course, provided you let me have her tail." This was agreed to, and it being cut off, I delivered my calf to the chief of the butchers, received the money, and returned home. On my arrival at home, my mother asked if I had sold the calf, to which I replied, "Yes, for a course, and her tail into the bargain." She thought me stupid or mad, and inquired what I would do with the latter. I answered, "I will have amply revenged on the sharpers, who pretended that my calf was a she-goat, and forced for them, at least, 1,000 times the price they gave me." After this, I skinned the tail, cut the leather into tongs, and twisted them into a whip with hard, thick knots. I then disguised myself in female attire, taking pains to make myself look as handsome as possible, with the assistance of my mother, who put sorma into my eyelids, and arranged my eyebrows, stained my hands with henna, and directed me how to ogle and smile. In short, as I was then a beardless lad, and reckoned comely, I appeared as a very desirable maiden in my disguise. On my arrival at the house of the chief of the butchers, I found him sitting with his companions in the court. The whole of my calf had been cooked in various ways, and they were just going to spread the cloth and feast upon it. On my entrance, I made a profound salutation, upon which they all rose up to return it, and having seated me welcomingly, whispered one to another, saying, "By Allah, this will be a night of glorious festivity, illumined by so much beauty. However, our chief must have the preference. This night shall be his, after which we will all cast lots for his turn of enjoyment." When we had feasted on my calf, and the night was far advanced, the butchers took leave, departed to their homes, and I remained alone with the chief, who began to entertain me with amusing conversation. Observing a rope hanging from the ceiling of an apartment, I, as if ignorant of its purpose, inquired the use of it, when the venerable chief of the butchers informed me it was for suspending animals to cut up, also occasionally his dependents, whose crimes required the punishment of flogging. Upon this I expressed a great desire to be tied with the rope, drawn up and swung for amusement. "My dear lady," replied he, "the cord will hurt thy delicate skin, but thou shalt put it around me, draw me up, and see the use without injuring thyself." I consented to the wish of the chief butcher, placed the cord under his arms, and drew him up till the ends of his toes scarcely touched the ground. I then secured the rope, and for some moments kept running playfully around him, and tickling his sides, which made him laugh with delight. At length, tired of his posture, he desired me to release him, but I refused, saying, "My dear chief, I have not yet finished my amusement." After which I tore the clothes from his back as if in merriment. When I had done this, I pulled out my whip, which was well knotted, saying, "This is the tail of a she-goat, not a calf." The butcher now began to be somewhat alarmed, asked me who I was and whence I came, to which I replied, "I am the owner of the fat calf, of which thou and thy villainous companion so rascally cheated me." I then bared my arm to my elbow, and so belabored his back and sides with my whip that he roared in agony. Nor did I leave off till his skin was completely flayed, and he fainted from the pain. After this I searched the apartment, found a bag containing 300 dinars, some handsome dresses, and other valuable articles, all of which I bundled up and carried off, leaving the chief of the butchers suspended to his fate. When I reached home, I gave my prize to my mother, saying, "This is only part of the value of my calf, which I have just received of the purchaser." Early in the morning, the butchers repaired, as usual, to the residence of their chief, and finding the door of the courtyard locked, joked one with another, saying, "Our old gentleman has been so fatigued with his happiness that he sleeps longer than ordinary." They waited till near noon, when they called out for admittance, but receiving no answer, became apprehensive of some disaster, and forcing the door, found their chief suspended almost lifeless, and his scars dropping blood. To their inquiries into the cause of his doleful situation, he replied, "That pretended vixen was no woman, but a brawny youth, the owner of the calf, who, in return for our roguery, has flogged me thus and carried off all he could find in my chamber worth having." The butchers vowed revenge, saying, "We will seize and put him to death." But their chief requested them for the present to be patient and carry him to a warm bath, that he might wash and get his wounds dressed. I observed the chief butcher enter the bathing house alone, while his followers waited at the gate, upon which I went to the slaughter-house, poured over my back the blood of a sheep, dabbed it with plasters of cotton, and leaning on a crutch, as if in agony of pain, repaired to the bath. At first the butchers refused me admittance, saying their chief was within, but on my entreating their compassion for my miserable condition, they at length permitted me to enter. Passing through the different rooms, I came to the bath, in which I found the unfortunate chief washing his scars. I pulled out my whip, and having said to him, "Shek, this is the tail of my calf," flogged him again so severely that he fainted, after which I made my escape by another entrance to the Hammam, which opened into a different street. The butchers, growing impatient at the long stay of their chief in the bath, at length entered, and found him in extreme agony. He informed them of the second revenge of the owner of the calf, and requested that he would take him into the country, pitch a tent for his reception, and remain to guard him till he should be cured of his wounds. They did so, but I watched their motions, and disguising myself, repaired in the evening toward the tent. Here I found a Bedouin Arab, who I bribed with a piece of gold to cry out, "I am the owner of the calf, and will have the life of your chief," cautioning him at the same time, after he had so exclaimed, to make his escape as quickly as possible from the butchers, who would pursue him. "I shall not heed them," replied he, "though they may be mounted on the fleetest coursers." Having said this, the Bedouin went up close to the tents, bawling out vociferously as I had directed him, upon which all the butchers started up and pursued him, but in vain, to a great distance. I then entered the tent in which the chief was reposing alone, and pulling out my whip, once more flogged him till he roared with agony. When I was tired, I bundled up such articles as I could lay my hands on, and returning home, presented them to my mother, saying, "Here is the balance of the price of our calf." The butchers, having attempted to overtake the Bedouin till they were wearied with running but in vain, returned to their chief, whom they found in a fainting fit from the pain of his wounds. Having sprinkled water on his face, they recovered him so far that he was able to inform them of what had happened, and to request them to convey him once more to his own house, to give out that he was dead of his wounds, and make a mock funeral, when possibly the owner of the calf, believing him departed this life, might cease to torment him. The butchers obeyed the commands of their chief, and reporting that he was dead, laid him in a litter and marched in mournful procession toward a burying ground, followed by a great concourse of people. Mixing with the crowd, in disguise, I at length stooped under the litter, and giving the chief, who lay extended in a winding sheet, a smart poke with a pointed stick, up he jumped, to the astonishment of the beholders, who cried out, "A miracle! A miracle! The dead is raised to life!" While I made my escape in the throng, but being fearful that the many tricks I had played, especially this last, might excite inquiry and lead to a discovery, I fled from the city and resolved to remain in this cave till curiosity should subside. The Sultan exclaimed, "These adventures are surprising," when the second inhabitant of the cave said, "My lord, my story is much more wonderful than the last, for I contrive not only to be dead and buried, but to escape from the tomb." "Possibly," said the Sultan, "thy adventures may have been stranger than those of this man, but if any of you are acquainted with the memoirs of ancient monarchs, I would wish you to relate them. However, at present I must take you with me to the palace, that I may make you welcome." When the men heard this proposition, they were alarmed and cried out, "What, my lord? Would you carry us to the city from which we have escaped to save our lives?" "Fear not," replied he. "I am the Sultan, and was amusing myself with hunting when I chanced to discover your cave." They bowed themselves before him and exclaimed, "To hear is to obey." After which they attended him to the city. On their arrival, the Sultan ordered them proper apartments with suitable entertainment, and invested each of them with rich habit. For some days they remained enjoying themselves, when at length, one evening, the Sultan commanded them to his presence, and requested a narrative, when one of them related the following story. End of section 31. The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Vol.4, translated by Jonathan Scott, Section 32. The Sultan and the Traveler. History of the Sultan of Hind. In ancient days there lived a Sultan of Hind, than whom no prince of the age was greater in extent of territory, riches, or force. But heaven had not allotted to him offspring, either male or female, on which account he was involved in sorrow. One morning, being even more melancholy than usual, he put on a red habit and repaired to his divan, when his vizier, alarmed at the robes of mourning, said, "What can have occasioned my lord to put on this gloomy habit?" "Alas," replied the Sultan, "my soul is in this morning overclouded with melancholy." "Repair then to the treasury," said the vizier, "and view thy wealth, as perhaps the luster of gold and the brilliant sparkling of jewels may amuse thy senses and disperse thy sorrow." "Vizier," answered the Sultan, "this world to me is all vanity. I regard nothing but the contemplation of the Deity. Yet how can I be relieved from melancholy, since I have lived to this age, and he has not blessed me with children, either sons or daughters, who are the ornaments of manhood in this world?" The Sultan had scarcely ceased speaking, when a human figure of a dusky hue appeared before him and said, "My sovereign, here is a confection left me by my ancestors, with an assurance that whoever might eat of it would have offspring." The Sultan eagerly took the confection, and by the blessing of Allah, one of the ladies of his harem conceived that very night. When her pregnancy was made known to him, the Sultan was overjoyed, distributed large sums in charity to the poor, and every day comforted the distressed by his bounty. When the Sultana had gone her full term, she was delivered of a son, beautiful in aspect and of graceful person, at which the Sultan became overjoyed, and on that day set apart one half of his treasure for the use of the infant prince, who was entrusted to the charge of experienced nurses. After he thrived sufficiently at the breast he was weaned, and at 6 years of age put under the care of learned tutors, who taught him to write, to read the Koran, and instructed him in the other several branches of literature. When he had completed his 12th year, He was accomplished in horsemanship, archery, and throwing the lance, till at length he became a distinguished cavalier, and excelled the most celebrated equestrians. The young prince, being on a certain day hunting in the vicinity of the capital, there suddenly appeared soaring and wheeling in the air a bird, whose plumage was of the most beautiful and glossy green. The prince let fly an arrow, but without effect, and the bird suddenly disappeared. It was in vain that he turned his eye to all quarters, in hopes of again discovering his wish for prey. When the bird had flown out of sight, and the prince, after searching in all directions till the close of day, returned vexed and much disappointed to his father's palace. On his entrance, the Sultan and the Sultana, perceiving his countenance gloomy, inquired the cause of his melancholy, when he informed them of the bird, upon which they said, "Dear son, the creatures of the Almighty are innumerable, diversified, and, doubtless, there are many birds as beautiful and wonderfully more so than this, whose escape you so much regret." "It may be so," replied the prince, "but unless I shall be able to take this, which so captivated my fancy, I will abstain from food." On the following morning the prince repaired again to the chase, and having reached the same spot on the plain, to his great joy, beheld the green bird. Having taken a cautious aim, he let fly an arrow, but she evaded it, and soared before him in the air. The prince spurred his courser and followed, keeping his desired prey in sight unceasingly till sunset, when both himself and his horse, being exhausted, he gave up the pursuit, and returned towards the city. As he was riding slowly, and almost fainting with hunger and fatigue, there met him a venerable-looking personage, who said, "Prince, both thyself and thy charger seem exhausted. What can have been the cause of such over-exercise?" "Father," answered the prince, "I have been pursuing, but in vain, a beautiful green bird, on which I had set my mind." "Son," replied the sage, "if thou wert to follow it for a whole year's journey, thy pursuit would be useless, for thou couldst never take it. This bird comes from the city in the country of Kafur, in which are most delightful gardens abounding in such birds as this, and many other species still more beautiful, some of which sing enchantingly, and others talk like human beings. But, alas, thou canst never reach that happy spot. Give up then all thoughts of the bird, and seek some other object for a favorite, that thou mayst enjoy repose, and no longer vex thyself for impossibilities." When the prince heard this from the old man, he exclaimed, "By Allah, nothing shall prevent me from visiting the charming country thou hast mentioned." And leaving the sage, he rode homewards, his mind wholly taken up in meditating on the land of Kafur. When the prince had reached the palace, the Sultan, perceiving his disordered state, inquired the adventures of the day, and being informed of his fruitless pursuit and the remarks of the old man, said, "My son, discharge this idle chimera from thy mind, nor perplex thyself longer, since he who wishes for an impossibility may pine himself to death, but can never gain his desires. Calm then thy soul, nor vex thyself longer in vain." "By Allah," answered the prince, "my soul, O my father, is captivated with the desire of possessing this bird more strongly than ever, from the words of the venerable old man, nor is it possible I can enjoy repose till I have traveled to the island of Kafur, and beheld the gardens containing such a wonderful feathered species." "Alas, my dear son," exclaimed the Sultan, "think how afflicting must be to myself and thy mother thy absence from our sight, and for our sakes give up such a fruitless expedition." The prince, notwithstanding the remonstrances of his father, continued obstinate, and said, "My traveling is inevitable. Grant me then permission, or I will put myself to death." "If so," exclaimed the frightened Sultan, "there is no refuge or help but from the omnipotent Allah. Well has the proverb remarked, that the nestling would not be restrained from the air, when suddenly the raven pounced upon it and bore it away. Heaven guard my son from the consequences of his imprudence." Having said thus, the Sultan commanded preparations for the requisites of travel, and ordered a force to accompany the headstrong prince, who, having taken leave of his afflicted parents, began his expedition towards the country of Kafur. The prince pursued his journey without any extraordinary adventure for a whole month, and at the expiration of it arrived at a spot from which branched out 3 roads. At the junction of them was erected a lofty pyramid, each face fronting one of the roads. On one face was inscribed, "This is named the Path of Safety." On the second, "This is called the Way of Repentance." And on the third, "Whoever follows this road will not probably return." "I will pursue this last," said the prince to himself, and accordingly striking into it, proceeded onwards for 20 days, at the end of which he encamped near a desolate city, crumbling into ruin, wholly destitute of inhabitants. He commanded his attendants, as no provisions could be found in the city, to kill 5 sheep of the flock he had brought with him and dress them for their refreshment in various ways. When all were ready, and the sammat was spread out, having performed his ablutions, he sat down with his principal followers. The prince and his company had scarcely seated themselves, when lo! there advanced from the desolate city a genie, whom the prince seeing, stood up and thus accosted: "Hail and welcome to the sovereign of Un, friendly to his brethren, and ruler of this extensive desert." He then addressed him flatteringly, in fluent language and in eloquent expression. The hair of this Une genie hung shaggily over his eyes, and flowed in matted tresses upon his shoulders. The prince took out a pair of scissors, and having condescendingly cut his hair, pared his nails, and washed him, seated him at the cloth, and placed before him the dish dressed so peculiarly for himself. The Une ate, and was delighted with the affability of the prince, whom he addressed, saying, "By Allah, O Mohammed, son of a sultan, I am doomed to death by thy arrival here, but what, my lord, was thy object in coming?" Upon this the prince informed him of his having seen the bird, his vain attempts to take her, the account he had received from the old man, and his resolution, in consequence of this information, to penetrate to the kingdom of Kafur, to visit the gardens, and bring away some of the wonderful birds. When the Une heard this, he said, "O son of a sultan, that country to thee is impenetrable, thou canst not reach it, for the distance from hence is a journey of 300 years to the most laborious traveler. How then canst thou hope to arrive at it, much more return? But, my son, the good old proverb remarks, that kindness should be returned with kindness, and evil with evil, and then none are so cruel or so benevolent as inhabitants of the desert. As thou hast treated me kindly, so God willing shall thou have a return for thy goodness. But thou must leave here thy attendants and thy effects. Thou and I only will go together, and I will accomplish thy wish in gratitude for what thou hast done for me." The prince immediately retired from his encampment with the One, who said, "Mount upon my shoulders." The prince obeyed the commands of the One, who, having first stopped his rider's ears with cotton, mounted into the air, and after soaring for some hours descended. When the prince found himself in the island of Kafur, and near the desired garden, having alighted from the shoulders of the generous One, he examined the spot, beheld groves, blooming shrubs, flowers bordering clear streams, and beautiful birds chanting various melodies. The Une said, "Behold the object of thy search. Enter the garden." Upon this the prince left him, passed the gate, which was open, and entered. He walked on every quarter, and depending from the branches of flowering shrubs, saw cages holding a variety of beautiful birds, 2 birds in each cage. The prince took down a large cage, and having examined the birds, placed in it such as pleased him to the number of 6, with which he was preparing to leave the garden, when at the gate a watchman met him, who cried out loudly, "A robber! A robber!" Instantly numerous guards rushing out, seized the prince, bound, and carried him before the sultan, to whom they complained, saying, "We found him in the garden, this young man, carrying off a cage with 6 birds. He must certainly be a robber." The sultan addressed the prince, saying, "What induced thee, youthful stranger, to violate my property, trespass on the garden, and attempt stealing these birds?" The prince returned no answer, upon which the sultan exclaimed, "Young man, Thou art verging upon death, yet still, if thy soul is bent upon having these birds, bring me from the Black Island some bunches of grapes, which are composed of emeralds and diamonds, and I will give thee 6 birds, in addition to those thou hast stolen." Having said this, the Sultan released the prince, who repaired to his generous friend the Une, whom he informed of the unlucky conclusion of his adventure. "Our task is an easy one," answered the Une. "Mount upon my shoulders." The prince did as he was desired, and after 2 hours' flight the Une descended and alighted. When the prince found himself in the Black Island, he immediately advanced toward the garden in which was the fruit composed of emeralds and diamonds. On the way a monster met him of terrible appearance. The monster sprung at the prince, who, with surprising agility, drawing his sword, wounded the furious beast on the forehead with such effect that, uttering a dreadful groan, he fell dead at his feet. It happened, by divine decree, that the Sultan's daughter, looking from a window of the harem, beheld the combat, and, stricken with the manly beauty and the prowess of the prince, exclaimed, "Who can withstand thy courage, or who resist thy all-conquering charms?" But he did not see the princess, or hear her applause. The prince, after having slain the monster, proceeded to the garden, the gate of which he found open, and on entering perceived variety of artificial trees composed of precious stones. Among them was one resembling the vine, the fruits of which were of emeralds and diamonds. He plucked off 6 bunches, and was quitting the garden, when a sentinel met him, who, being alarmed, cried out, "A robber! A robber!" The guards rushed out, and having bound him, carried him before the Sultan, saying, "My lord, we found this youth stealing the fruit from the garden of jewels." The Sultan was enraged, and on the point of ordering him to be put to death, when a number of persons entered, crying out, "Good tidings to our sovereign!" "On what account?" exclaimed the Sultan. "The horrible monster," replied they, "who used annually to appear and devour our sons and daughters, we have just now found dead and cloven in 2. The Sultan was so rejoiced at this happy event, that he refrained from the blood of the prince, and exclaimed, "Whoever has destroyed this monster, let him come to me, and I swear by Allah, who has invested me with royalty, that I will give him my daughter in marriage, and whatever else he may desire, even to the half of my empire." Upon the Sultan's declaration being proclaimed, several young men appeared, pretending that they had killed the monster, and gave various accounts of the combat, which made the prince smile. "By Allah, it is strange," said the Sultan, "that a youth in such a perilous situation should be so unconcerned as to smile." While the Sultan was ruminating on this occurrence, an eunuch entered from the harem, requesting that he would come and speak to the princess, his daughter, who had business of importance to communicate, upon which the Sultan arose, and retired from the hall of audience. When the Sultan had entered the princess's apartment, he said, "What can have happened which has occasioned you to send for me so suddenly?" She replied, "Is it thy wish to know who slew the monster and to reward the courageous hero?" "By Allah," answered the Sultan, "who created subjects and their sovereigns, if I can discover him, my first offer to him shall be to espouse thee, whatever be his condition, or though he dwell in the most distant region." The princess rejoined, "No one slew the monster but the youth who entered the garden of gems, and was bearing off the fruit, whom thou wast just now on the point of putting to death." When the Sultan heard the above from his daughter, he returned to the divan, and calling the prince before him, said, "Young man, I grant thee thy pardon. Art thou he who destroyed the monster?" "I am," replied the prince. The Sultan would instantly have summoned the Kazi to perform the espousals, but the prince said, "I have a friend to consult. Permit me to retire, and I will soon return." The Sultan consented, saying, "Thy request is but reasonable, but come back quickly." The prince, having repaired to his friend the Une, informed him of what had happened to him, and of the offer of the Sultan's daughter in marriage, upon which the Une said, "Accept the princess, but on condition that, if you marry her, you shall be allowed to carry her to your own kingdom." The prince, having returned to the Sultan, proposed his terms, which were readily agreed to. and the nuptials were celebrated with the most splendid magnificence. After abiding in the palace of the Sultan for a month and 3 days, he requested permission to depart with his bride towards his own country, which was granted. On the departure of the prince, his father-in-law presented him with 100 bunches of the grapes composed of emeralds and diamonds, and he repaired to his friend the Une, who, having first stopped their ears with cotton, mounted them upon his shoulders, and soaring into the air, after 2 hours descended near the capital of the island of Kafur. The prince, taking 4 bunches of the jeweled fruit, hastened to the palace, and laid them before the Sultan, who, in astonishment, exclaimed, "Surely this young stranger must be a powerful magician, or how could he have traveled the distance of 300 years' journey and have accomplished his purpose in less than 3 months? Such an action is truly miraculous. Hast thou indeed, young man," said the Sultan, "been at the Black Island?" "I have," answered the prince. "Describe it to me," replied the Sultan, "its appearance, its buildings, its gardens, and rivers." The prince having answered all his queries, the Sultan said, "Noble youth, you may assuredly ask of me whatever you wish." "I want nothing but the birds," rejoined the prince. "They are thine," returned the Sultan. "But annually on a certain day, and this is it, there descends from yonder mountain a monstrous vulture, which tears in pieces our men, women, and children, and having flown away with them in his gigantic talons, devours their flesh. I have a beautiful daughter, whom, if thou canst overcome this calamitous monster, I will give to thee in marriage." The prince replied, "I will consult my friend," and they returned to the One, whom he informed of the offer, but he had scarcely done speaking when lo, the vulture appeared, upon which the Une, ascending into the air, attacked the monster, and after a fierce combat, tore him into halves, after which he descended to the prince and said, "Go to the Sultan, and acquaint him that his destructive enemy is slain." The prince did as he was directed, upon which the Sultan with his train, and an immense crowd of the inhabitants of the city, came out on horseback, and beheld the monstrous vulture, stretched dead on the ground, torn in halves. The Sultan then conducted the Prince of the Hind to the palace, where his marriage with the princess was instantly celebrated, amid the highest festivity and rejoicings. And after remaining a full month at the Sultan's court, he requested leave to depart, when his father-in-law presented him with 10 cages, in each of which were 4 of the beautiful birds of variously colored plumage, and dismissed him, after an affectionate farewell with his daughter. The prince, having departed from the Sultan, repaired to his faithful friend the Une, who welcomed his return, and having mounted him upon his back with his 2 brides, his jewel fruit, and the cages, immediately ascended into the air, from whence, after soaring for some hours, he gradually descended and alighted near the ruined city, where the prince had left his tents, cattle, and followers, whom he found anxiously expecting his arrival. The friendly Une had scarcely set him down when he said to the prince, "My young friend Mohammed, the obligation already conferred upon me by thy coming here was great, but I have one more favor to request." "What can that be?" replied the prince. "That thou leave not this spot," continued the Une, "until thou hast washed my corpse, and shrouded, and laid it in the grave." Having said thus, the Une suddenly uttered one loud groan, and instantly his soul took its flight from the body. The astonished prince stood for some time overpowered with sorrow, but at length recovering himself, he, with the assistance of his domestics, washed the corpse, wrapped it in a winding sheet, and having prayed over it, deposited it in the earth. The funeral ceremonies of his friend being over, he commenced his march homewards, and after 3 days arrived in sight of the inscribed pyramid, near which he perceived an extensive encampment, which, on reconnoitering, he found to be that of his father. The aged Sultan, unable to bear the absence of his son, had marched from his capital in hopes of overtaking him. But on his arrival at the junction of the 3 ways, being confounded at the sight of the inscriptions, he had halted, not knowing where to proceed. Great was his joy on discovering the prince advancing toward that face of the pyramid on which was engraved, "Whoever travels this road will probably never return." When the raptures of meeting and mutual congratulations were over, the prince informed the Sultan of his wonderful and successful adventures, which overpowered him with astonishment and joy. After reposing a few days, they proceeded toward the capital of the Sultan, where tidings having arrived of their approach, the inhabitants ornamented the city with silks, carpets, and transparent paintings, and the nobles and respectful persons issued forth with splendid trains to meet and congratulate their sovereign and the prince, who entered in triumphal procession amid the greatest rejoicing and prayers for their welfare and prosperity. End of section 32. Recording by Nico Williams. Volume 4. Translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 33. Story of the Fisherman's Son. A fisherman's son, having in company with his father, caught a large fish. The latter proposed to present it to the Sultan, in hopes of receiving a great reward. While he was gone home to fetch a basket, the son, moved by compassion, returned the fish into the water, but fearful of his father's anger, fled from his country and repaired to a distant city, where he was entertained by a person as a servant. Strolling one day in the market, he saw a Jew purchase of a lad a cock at a very high price, and sent it by his slave to his wife, with orders to keep it safely till his return home. The fisherman's son, supposing that as the Jew gave so great a price for the cock, it must possess some extraordinary property, resolved to obtain it, and accordingly, having bought 2 large fowls, carried them to the Jew's wife, whom he informed that her husband had sent him for the cock which he had exchanged for the fowls. She gave it to him, and he, having retired, killed the bird, in whose entrails he found a magical ring, which being rubbed by his touch, a voice proceeded from it demanding what were the commands of its possessor, which should be immediately executed by the genii who were servants of the ring. The fisherman's son was rejoiced at his good fortune, and while meditating what use he should make of his ring, passed by the Sultan's palace, at the gates of which were suspended many human heads. He inquired the reasons, and was informed that they were those of the unfortunate princes, who, having failed in performing the conditions on which the Sultan's daughter was offered them in marriage, had been put to death. Hoping to be more fortunate than them by the aid of his ring, he resolved to demand the princess's hand. He rubbed the ring, which the voice asked his commands, upon which he required a rich dress, and it was instantly laid before him. He put it on, repaired to the palace, and being introduced to the Sultan, demanded his daughter to wife. The Sultan consented, on condition that his life should be forfeited unless he should remove a lofty and extensive mound of sand that lay on one side of the palace, which must be done before he could wed the princess. He accepted the condition, but demanded an interval of 40 days to perform the task. This being agreed to, he took his leave, and having repaired to his lodging, rubbed his ring, commanded the genie to remove the mound, and erect on the space it covered a magnificent palace, and to furnish it suitably for a royal residence. In 15 days the task was completed. He was wedded to the princess and declared heir to the Sultan. In the meanwhile, the Jew whom he had tricked of the cock and the magical ring resolved to travel in search of his lost prize, and at last arrived at the city, where he was informed of the wonderful removal of the mound and the erection of the palace. He guessed that it must have been done by means of his ring, to recover which he planned the following stratagem. Having disguised himself as a merchant, he repaired to the palace, and cried for sale valuable jewels. The princess, hearing him, sent an attendant to examine them and inquire their price, when the Jew asked in exchange only old rings. This being told to the princess, she recollected that her husband kept an old shabby-looking ring in his writing-stand, and he being asleep, she took it out, and sent it to the Jew, who, knowing it to be the one he had so long sought for, eagerly gave for it all the jewels in his basket. He retired with his prize, and having rubbed the ring, commanded the genie to convey the palace and all its inhabitants, excepting the fisherman's son, into a distant desert island, which was done instantly. The fisherman's son, on awaking in the morning, found himself lying on the mound of sand, which had reoccupied its old spot. He arose, and in alarm lest the Sultan should put him on death in revenge for the loss of his daughter, fled to another kingdom as quickly as possible. Here he endured a disconsolate life, subsisting on the sale of some jewels which he happened to have upon his dress at his flight. Wandering one day through a town, a man offered him a sale a dog, a cat, and a rat, which he purchased and kept, diverting his melancholy with their tricks and uncommon playfulness together. These seeming animals proved to be magicians, who, in return for his kindness, agreed to recover for their master his lost prize, and informed him of their intention. He eagerly thanked them, and they all set out in search of the palace, the ring, and the princess. At length they reached the shore of the ocean, after much travel, and descried the island on which it stood, when the dog swam over, carrying on his back the cat and the rat. Being landed, they proceeded to the palace, when the rat entered and perceived the Jew asleep upon a sofa, with the ring laid before him, which he seized in his mouth and then returned to his companions. They began to cross the sea, as before, but when about half over, the dog expressed a wish to carry the ring in his mouth. The rat refused, lest he should drop it, but the dog threatened, unless he would give it him, to dive and drown them both in the sea. The rat, alarmed for his life, complied with his demand, but the dog missed his aim in snatching at the ring, which fell into the ocean. They landed and informed the fisherman's son of his loss, upon which he, in despair, resolved to drown himself, when suddenly, as he was going to execute his purpose, a great fish, appearing with the ring in his mouth, swam close to shore, and having dropped it within reach of the despairing youth, miraculously exclaimed, "I am the fish which you released from captivity, and thus reward you for your generosity." The fisherman's son, overjoyed, returned to his father-in-law's capital, and at night, rubbing the ring, commanded the genie to convey the palace to its old site. This being done in an instant, he entered the palace, and seized the Jew, whom he commanded to be cast alive into a burning pile, in which he was consumed. From this period he lived happily with his princess, and on the death of the Sultan succeeded to his dominions. End of section 33. Recording by Nico Williams.
Entertainments, Volume 4, translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 34 of Abu Niyut and Abu Niyutan, or the well-intentioned and the double-minded. A person named Abu Niyut, or the well-intentioned, being much distressed in his own country, resolved to seek a better livelihood in another. Accordingly, he took with him all he possessed, being only one single sheriff, and began his journey. He had not traveled far when there overtook him a man who entertained him with his conversation, in the course of which it appeared that his name was Abu Niyutan, or double-minded. Being upon the same scheme, they agreed to seek their fortunes together, and it was settled that Abu Niyut should be the purse-bearer of the common stock. The other possessed 10 sheriffs. After some days of toilsome journey, they reached a city, on entering which a beggar accosted them, crying out, "Worthy believers, disburse your alms, and ye shall be rewarded tenfold." Upon this, Abu Niyut gave him a sheriff. When his companion, enraged at what he thought was prodigality, demanded back his money, which was given him, and he marched off, leaving his new friend without anything. Abu Niyut, resigned to his fate, and relying on Providence, proceeded to a mosque to pay his devotions, hoping to meet some charitable person who would relieve his necessities. But he was mistaken. For a night and day he remained in the mosque, but no one offered him charity. Pressed by hunger, he in the dusk of evening stole out and wandered with fainting steps through the streets. At length, perceiving a servant throwing the fragments of an eating cloth, he advanced, and gathering them up, sat down in a corner, and gnawed the bones and half-eaten morsels with eagerness. After which, lifting up his eyes towards the heaven, he thanked God for his scanty meal. The servant, who had observed his motions, was surprised and affected at his wretched condition and devotion, of which he informed his master, who, being a charitable man, took from his purse 10 sheriffs, which he ordered the servant to give to Abu Niyut. The servant, through avarice, having retained 1 sheriff as a perquisite, delivered the rest to Abu Niyut, who, having counted the money, thanked God for his bounty, but said, agreeably to the scriptural declaration, he ought to have had 10-fold for the sheriff he had given to the beggar. The master of the servant, overhearing this, called Abu Niyut upstairs, and having seated him, inquired his story, which he faithfully related to the host, who was a capital merchant, and was so much pleased at his pious simplicity that he resolved to befriend him, and desired him to abide for the present in his house. Abu Niyut had resided some days with his friendly host when the season arrived at which the merchant, who was punctual in discharging the duties of religion, having examined his stock, set apart the 10th of it in kind, and bestowed it upon his guest, whom he advised to open a shop and try his fortune in trade. Abu Niyut did so, and was so successful that in a few years he became one of the most reputable merchants in the place. At the end of this period, sitting one day in his warehouse, he saw in the streets, wretchedly habited, lean, and with eyes sunken and dim, his old companion Abu Niyut, begging alms of passengers with the importunate cry of distress. Abu Niyut, compassionating his miserable situation, ordered a servant to call him to him, and on his arrival, having seated him, sent for refreshments to relieve his immediate want. He then invited him to spend the night at his house, and in the evening, having shut up his warehouse, conducted him home, where a bath was made warm for him, and when he had bathed, he was presented with a change of handsome apparel. Supper was served, and when they had eaten till they were satisfied, they conversed on several subjects. At length, Abu Niyut exclaimed, "Dost thou not recollect me, my brother?" "No, by Allah, most liberal host," replied the other. "But who art thou?" "I was," answered Abu Niyut, "the companion of thy travel at such a period, but my disposition is still unchanged, nor have I forgotten our old connection. Half of what I possess is thine." Having said this, Abu Niyut balanced his accounts and gave half of his property to his distressed fellow traveler, who with it stocked a warehouse and traded for himself with good success. For some time the two friends lived near each other in great repute, when Abu Niyut, growing restless, requested Abu Niyut to quit their present abode and travel for recreation and profit. "My dear friend," replied Abu Niyut, "why should we travel? Have we not here affluence and ease? And what more can we enjoy in any part of the world?" This remonstrance had no effect on Abu Niyut, who became so importunate that at length his kind friend yielded to his whim. They loaded an ample stock of merchandise on mules and camels, and departed for the city of Mosul. After traveling 10 days, they, one evening, encamped near a deep well, round which they took up their lodging. In the morning Abu Niyut, by his own desire, was let down into the well more readily to fill the water bags for the use of the caravan, men and cattle, little apprehending what was by Providence decreed to befall him. For his ungrateful friend, who envied his prosperity and coveted his wealth, having loaded the beasts, cut the rope at the top of the well, and leaving him to his fate, departed. Abu Niyut remained all day without food, but humbly putting his trust in Allah for deliverance. About the middle of the following night, he overheard 2 Afrits in conversation with each other, when one said, "I am now perfectly happy, for at length I have possessed the beautiful princess of Mosul, and no one can drive me away, unless by sprinkling the infusion of wormwood under her feet on a Friday during divine service in the great mosque, a recipe which will hardly be found out." "I," continued the other Afrit, have been as fortunate as yourself, for I am in possession of such a hidden treasure of gold and jewels under the mound near Mosul as cannot be computed, the talisman of which cannot be opened to anyone unless by killing on the mound a white cock and pouring over it the blood, which secret, I judge, will not be found out by man." Having said this, the Afrits took their flight from the well. Abu Niyut treasured up in his mind the conversation of the Afrits, and at daylight was happily delivered from the well by the arrival of a caravan, some of the followers of which were let down to fill water, and having discovered him, charitably drew him up and gave him some refreshments. When he was somewhat revived by them, they inquired by what accident he had remained in the well, and he, concealing the treachery of his ungrateful companion, informed them that having reposed to sleep on the edge he had fallen in, and not being missed at the time by his fellow travelers, the caravan had proceeded on its journey. He then begged leave to accompany his generous deliverers to Mosul, to which they agreed, and liberally furnished him with a conveyance. On entering the city, Abu Niyut perceived all the people in motion, and on inquiring the reason, was informed that they were hastening to the great square before the palace to see the beheading of a physician who had failed in attempting to expel an evil spirit that had long possessed the daughter of the Sultan, and that such had been the fate of many unhappy men who had tried their skill upon the unfortunate princess. Upon this intelligence he hastened with all speed to the palace, and having obtained permission to the Sultan, made the usual prostrations, after which he offered to expel the evil spirit, and begged as part of his reward the sparing of the life of the unsuccessful physician. To this the Sultan for the present agreed, but declared that should Abu Niyut fail in his undertaking, he would execute them together, as ignorant pretenders in their art. Abu Niyut then begged that the trial of his skill might be deferred till the Friday, which he requested of the Sultan might be solemnly observed, as the devout prayers of all true believers would draw down a blessing on his operations. The Sultan consented, and the unfortunate physician was released from the executioner and commanded to be kept in the palace, in which Abu Niyut had also an apartment allotted to him. Proclamation was then made through the city for the strict celebration of the approaching Sabbath, under pain of the royal displeasure on those who should neglect it. Friday being arrived, and the whole city assembled at prayers, Abu Niyut prepared his infusion of wormwood, as the Afrit had mentioned. Being introduced into the apartment of the princess, who lay in a melancholy stupor, he poured the infusion upon her feet, when a loud yell was heard near her, and she, starting up, as if from sleep, called upon her attendants to assist her in rising. News was immediately conveyed to the Sultan of the princess's recovery, and he came overjoyed to witness her returned senses. He commanded public rejoicings to be made, large sums to be distributed in alms, and desired Abu Niyut to demand what he chose in reward for his important service, at the same time ordering the unsuccessful physician to be set at liberty with a handsome present. Abu Niyut, who had been captivated by the beauty of the princess, asked as his reward her hand in marriage. Upon which the Sultan consulted with his viziers, who advised him to dismiss the petitioner for the present, with orders to return in the morning, when he should receive the Sultan's decision on a request which demanded much consideration. When Abu Niyut had retired, the viziers represented to the Sultan that it was fitting the husband of her daughter should at least possess great wealth, for though Abu Niyut had expelled the evil spirit, yet if he could not support her in a manner becoming her rank, he was not worthy to marry her. They therefore advised him to select a number of his most valuable jewels, to show them to Abu Niyut, and demand as a dowry for his princess some of equal estimation, which if he could produce, he was ready to receive him as a son-in-law, but if not, he must accept a compensation for his services more suited to his condition than the royal alliance. On Abu Niyut's appearance at court the next morning, the Sultan displayed the jewels and made the proposal advised by his viziers. When looking with the utmost indifference upon the brilliant stones before him, he assured the Sultan that he would the next day present him with 10 times the number, of superior value and luster, which declaration astonished the whole court, as it was known that no prince possessed richer gems than those in the possession of the Sultan of Mosul. Abu Niut, having taken leave of the Sultan, proceeded to the poultry market, and having purchased a cock entirely white and free from blemish, brought it to his lodgings, where he continued till the rising of the moon, when he walked out of the city alone, and speeded to the mound of bluish earth mentioned by the Afrit of the well to contain the invaluable hidden treasure. Being arrived at the mound, he ascended it, cut the throat of the cock, whose blood began to flow, when lo, the earth shook, and soon made an opening, through which, to his great satisfaction, he perceived such heaps of inestimable precious stones of all sorts as are not to be adequately described. Abu Niut now went back to the city, where, having procured 10 camels, with 2 panniers on each, he returned and loaded them with his treasure, which he conveyed to his lodging, having first filled up the cavity of the mound. In the morning Abu Niut repaired with his loaded camels to the palace, and entering the court of the divan, in which the Sultan sat expecting him, after a profound obeisance, cried out, "Descend for a moment, my lord, and examine the dowry of the princess." The Sultan, arising from his throne, came down the steps of the hall, and with the camels being made to kneel, he examined the panniers, and was so astonished at the richness of their contents, being jewels far surpassing his own in size and luster, that he exclaimed, "By Allah, if the treasures of all the sultans of the world were brought together, they could not afford gems equal to these." When somewhat recovered from his surprise, he inquired of his viziers how he should now act towards Abu Niut, when they all unanimously cried out, "By all means, give him your daughter." The marriage was then immediately celebrated with great splendor, and Abu Niut conducted himself so well in his high station that the Sultan, his father-in-law, committed to him the giving public audience in his stead, and the decision of all appeals 3 days in each week. Some time had elapsed after his elevation, when Abu Niut, one day giving audience in the magnificent hall of one of his country palaces, beheld a man among the crowd of a sorrowful aspect, dressed in a wretched habit, who cried, "O true believers, O charitable gentlemen, relieve the distressed." Abu Niut commanded one of his mace-bearers to bring him to his presence, and on his appearance recognized his treacherous companion who had left him in the well. Without making himself known or betraying any emotion but that of compassion, he ordered attendants to conduct him to the warm bath, in which, being refreshed, he was arrayed in a magnificent habit, and again brought to the divan. Abu Niut, having retired with him into a closet, said, "Knowest thou me not, my old friend?" "No, by Allah," replied the other. "Know then," returned he, "that I am Abu Niut, thy benefactor and companion, whom you treacherously left in the well." He then related all his adventures, concluding them with an assurance that so far from resenting his treachery, he regarded his conduit as the impulse of fate, and as the means by which he himself had attained his present dignity and affluence, which he would share with him. The envious heart of Abu Niutin was unconquerable, and instead of thanking the noble-minded Abu Niut for his forgiveness and liberality, he exclaimed, "Since the well has been to thee so fortunate, why should it not prove so also to me?" Having said this, he hastily rose up and quitted Abu Niut, who would not punish such rudeness, even without taking leave. Abu Niutin hastened with all speed to the well, having descended by a rope, sat down impatiently expecting the arrival of the Afrits, who, about midnight, alighted, and resting themselves on the terrace above, began to inquire each other's adventures. "Since we last met," said one, "I have been rendered miserable, for a cunning Mussulman found out the secret of overpowering me, and has married my princess. nor can I revenge myself, for he is under the protection of a converted genie, whom the prophet has appointed to watch over him. I, continued the other Efreet, have been equally unfortunate with thyself, for the same man who has wedded thy mistress discovered my hidden treasure, and keeps it in spite of my attempts to recover it. For let us fill up this abominable well, which must have been the cause of all our disasters. Having said thus, the two Efreets immediately hurled the terrace and large stones into the well, which crushed the ungrateful and envious Abu Niyutan to atoms. Some days after this, the good Abu Niyut, finding he did not return, repaired to the well, and seeing it fallen in, ordered it to be cleared, when the discovery of the body proved to him that the malicious spirit of the wretch had been the cause of his own destruction. He, with reverence, exclaimed, "There is no refuge but with the Almighty. May He preserve us from envy, which is destructive to the envious alone." Abu Niyut returned to the capital, where, not long after, his father-in-law, the Sultan, dying, left him heir to his kingdom. His succession was disputed by the husbands of the two elder sisters of his wife, but the ministers and people being in favor of the Sultan's will, they resigned their pretensions and submitted to his authority. His wife being brought to bed of a son, her sisters bribed the midwife to pretend that the Sultana had produced a dog. They did the same by another son. At the third lying in of the Sultana, Abu Niyut resolved to be present, and a beautiful princess appeared. The two infant princes, having been thrown at the gate of one of the royal palaces, were taken up by the gardener and his wife, who brought them up as their own. Abu Niyut, in visiting the garden with his daughter, who showed an instinctive affection for them, from this and their martial play with each other, having made horses of clay, bows and arrows, etc., was induced to inquire of the gardener whether they were really his own children. The gardener, upon this, related the circumstance of his having found them exposed at the gate of the palace, and mentioned the times, which agreed exactly with those of the Sultana's delivery. Abu Niyut then questioned the midwife, who confessed the imposition and the wickedness of the sisters, whom he left to be punished by the pangs of their own consciences, convinced that envy is its own severest tormentor. The young princes were acknowledged, and the good Abu Niyut had the satisfaction of seeing them grow up to follow his example. End of section 34. Nights Entertainments, Vol.4, translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 35, Adventure of a Courtier, related by himself to his patron, an emir of Egypt. It is related by an historian that there was an emir of the land of Egypt, whose mind, being one night unusually disturbed, he sent for one of his courtiers, a convivial companion, and said to him, "Tonight my bosom, from what cause I know not, is uncommonly restless, and I wish thee to divert me with some amusing narrative." The courtier replied, "To hear is to obey. I will describe an adventure which I encountered in the youthful part of my life. When a very young man, I was deeply in love with a beautiful Arab maiden, adorned by every elegance and grace, who resided with her parents, and I used frequently to visit their camp, for her family was one of the desert tribes. One day my mind felt uncommonly anxious concerning her, and I resolved to seek relief by a visit. But when I reached the spot, found neither my beloved nor any of her kindred. I questioned some passengers, who informed me that the family had removed their encampment from scarcity of forage for their herds and camels. I remained for some time on the ground, but observing no signs of their return, my impatience of absence became intolerable, and my love compelled me to travel in search of my charmer. Though the shades of evening were falling, I replaced the saddle upon my camel, put on my vestments, and girding on my saber, proceeded. I had advanced some distance, when the night became dismally black, and from the darkness I now sunk into sands and hollows, and now ascended declivities, while the yells of wild beasts resounded on every quarter. My heart beat with apprehension, and my tongue did not cease to repeat the attributes of the Almighty, our only defender in time of need. At length, stupor overcame my senses, and I slept, while my camel quitted the track and wandered from the route I had meant to pursue all night. Suddenly my head was violently intercepted by the branch of a tree, and I was awakened by the blow, which gave me infinite pain. As I recovered myself, I beheld trees, verdure, sprinkled with flowers, and a clear rivulet, also a variety of birds, whose notes were melodiously sweet. I alighted from my camel, and laid the bridle on my arm, as the underwood of the thicket was closely entwined. I did not cease leading my camel till I was out of the thicket, when I remounted, but at a loss which way to go, and unknowing where Providence might direct me. I reached the desert, and cast my eyes over the expanse, when lo, at length a smoke appeared in the midst of it. I whipped my camel, and at length reached a fire, and near it observed a handsome tent, before which was a standard planted, surrounded by spears, horses picketed, and camels grazing. I said to myself, what can mean this tent, which has a grand appearance in so solitary a plain? I then went to the rear of the tent and exclaimed, "Health to you, O inhabitants of this tent, and may the Almighty to you be merciful." Upon this there advanced from it a youth, seemingly about 19, who appeared graceful as the rising moon, and valor and benevolence gleamed upon his aspect. He returned my salutation and said, "Brother Arab, perchance thou hast missed thy way." I answered, "Yes, shew it, and may God requite thee." Upon which he replied, "My dwelling, brother Arab, is at present in this wild spot, but the night is dreary, and shouldst thou proceed there, is no surety against wild beasts tearing thee in pieces. Lodge then at present with me in safety and repose, and when day shall appear, I will direct thee on thy way." I alighted, when he took my camel, picketed her, and gave her water and fodder. He then retired for a while, but returned with a sheep, which he killed, flayed, and cut up, then lighted a fire, and when it was of a proper glow, broiled part of the sheep, which he had previously seasoned with sundry dried herbs, seeds, and spices, and when ready presented his cookery to me. During his hospitalities I observed that my kind host sometimes beat his breast and wept, from which I guessed that he was in love and a wanderer like myself. My curiosity was raised, but I said within myself, I am his guest. Why should I intrude upon him by painful questions? And refrained from inquiry. When I had eaten as much as sufficed me, the youth arose, went into his tent, and brought out a basin and ewer, with a napkin embroidered with silk and fringed with gold, also a cruet of rosewater, in which musk had been infused. I was astonished at his proceedings and the politeness of his demeanor, and exclaimed inwardly, "How wonderful is the abode of so accomplished a personage in this wild desert!" We made our ablutions and conversed a while upon various subjects, after which my gentle host went to his tent, from whence he brought out a piece of red silk damask, which he divided between us, saying, "Brother Arab, go into my tent and choose thy place of repose. For last night and today great must have been thy hardship and fatigue." I entered the tent, and in one partition of it found a mattress of green damask, upon which, having pulled off my upper garments, I lay down and slept so soundly that I never enjoyed before or since so refreshing a repose. At length I awoke, when night was far advanced, and became involved in thought respecting my hospitable host, but knew not what to conjecture, and was sinking again into slumber, when lo, gentle murmurs struck my ears, than which I never heard sound more soft or tenderly affecting. I lifted up the curtain of my partition and looked around, when I beheld a damsel, more beautiful than any I had ever seen, seated by the generous owner of the tent. They wept and complained of the agonies of love, of separation, and interruptions to their desire of frequent meetings. Then I said within myself, there is a wonderfully dignified appearance in this amiable youth. Yet he lives alone, and I have seen no other tent on the plain. What can I conjecture, but that this damsel must be a daughter of one of the good genii, who has fallen in love with him, and upon her account he has retired to this solitary spot. Respect for their love made me drop the curtain. I drew the coverlid over me and again fell asleep. When the morning dawned, I awoke, dressed, and having performed my ablutions and prayers, said to the young man, who had already risen, "Brother Arab, if in addition to thy hospitalities already shown thou wilt put me in my way, my obligations will be complete." He looked kindly and said, "If convenient, my brother, let me entertain thee as my guest for 3 days." I could not refuse his hospitable request, and abode with him. On the 3rd day, I ventured to inquire his name and family, when he replied, "I am of the noble tribe Azra," and I discovered that he was the son of my father's brother. "Son of my uncle," exclaimed I, "what can have induced thee to court the seclusion of this desert spot, and to quit thy kinsmen, neighbors, and dependents?" Upon hearing these words, the eyes of the youth became suffused with tears. He sighed, and said, "Ah, my cousin, I passionately admired the daughter of my uncle, and was so devoted to her that I asked her in marriage. But he refused me, and wedded her to another of our tribe, richer than myself, who carried her to his abode. When she was thus torn from me, despair agitated my soul. I quitted my relations, friends, and companions, became enamored of solitude, and retired to this lonely spot." When he had finished his communication, I said, "But where is the abode of thy beloved and thy successful rival?" He replied, "Near the summit of yonder mountain, from whence, as frequently as opportunity will allow, in the stillness of the night, when sleep hath overpowered the eyes of the village, she ventures to my tent, and we enjoy the company of each other. But believe me, my brother, our passion is innocent as devotional love. Hence I dwell here in the manner you have witnessed, and while she visits me, delightful will pass the hours, until Allah shall execute his appointed decrees, and reward our constancy in this world, or consign us to the grave together." When the unfortunate youth had concluded his narration, at which I was affected with sincere compassion for his circumstances, an eager desire to relieve the lovers from their oppressors occupied my mind, and after much consideration I addressed him thus: "If thou choosest, I think I can point out a plan which, under the blessing of Allah, may end the sufferings of thyself and thy beloved." He replied, "O son of my uncle, reveal it to me." And I continued, saying, "When night shall arrive and the damsel cometh, let us seat her upon my camel, for she is sure-footed and swift of pace. Do thou then mount thy steed, and I will accompany you upon one of your camels. We shall travel all night, and ere morning shall have passed the forest, when you will be safe, and thy heart will be rendered happy with thy beloved. The land of God is wide enough to afford us an asylum, and by heaven I swear that while life remains, I will be thy friend." The youth replied, "Son of my uncle, I will consult upon thy plan with my beloved, for she is prudent and well informed." When night had shut in, and the usual hour of the damsel's coming approached, my kind host impatiently expected her arrival, but in vain, for she did not appear. He rose, stood in the doorway of the tent, opened his mouth, and drew in the exhalations of the gale, then returned, sat down pensively for a few minutes, and at last, bursting into tears, exclaimed, "Ah, my cousin, there are no tidings of the daughter of my uncle. Some mishap must have befallen her. Remain here while I go in search of intelligence." Having said thus, he took up his saber, his lance, and departed. When somewhat more than an hour had elapsed, I heard his footstep, and soon perceived him advancing, bearing something bulky in his arms, while he called loudly upon me in a distressful tone. I hastened towards him, and upon my arrival he exclaimed, "Alas, alas, the beloved daughter of my uncle is no more, and I bear her remains. She was hastening as usual to my tent, when suddenly a lion sprung upon her in the path, and tore her in pieces. These relics are all that remain of my beloved. He then laid them down, and lo, the thigh bones of the damsel and part of her ribs. He wept piteously and said, "Remain here till I return," after which he departed with the swiftness of an arrow. In about an hour he returned, and in his hand was the head of the lion, which he threw down, and asked eagerly for water, which I brought him. He then washed his hands, cleansed the mouth of the lion, which he rapturously kissed, and wept bitterly for some moments. He then exclaimed, "By Allah, I conjure thee, O son of my uncle, and by the ties of relationship between us, that thou observe my will. For within this hour I shall follow my beloved. Be thou our mourner, and bury her remains with mine in the same grave." Having said this, he retired into the sleeping partition of the tent, where he remained at his devotions for an hour, then came out, beat his breast, sighed deeply, and at length heaved his expiring groan, saying, I come, my beloved, I come," and his pure soul took flight for the mansions of paradise. When I beheld his corpse, sad indeed was my condition, and from excess of sorrow I found it difficult to perform my promise. But at length I arose, washed, enshrouded, and laid the remains of these constant lovers in the same grave, near which I remained for 3 days in prayer and lamentation, after which I departed homewards, but I have not failed annually to visit the spot, to bedew the grave with my tears, and pray for the mercy of Allah to their souls and my own errors. End of section 35.
Entertainments, Volume 4, translated by Jonathan Scott, Section 36. Story of the Prince of Sind and Fatima, daughter of Amir bin Nauman. Some ages back, a certain Sultan of Sind had a son by a concubine, who behaved so rudely to his sultana that she became dispirited and lost her health, which her favorite woman observing, resolved by stratagem to get rid of the prince. She advised her mistress, when he might next insult her, to say to him, that he would never appear becoming his rank till he was beloved by Fatima, daughter of a sultan named Amir bin Nauman. The queen having followed the woman's directions, the prince resolved to travel to the country of the princess, and demand her in marriage. Accordingly, having obtained the consent of the sultan his father, he departed with an attendance suitable to his rank. After marching for some time, he entered a desert, which was covered with the numberless flights of locusts that had fallen exhausted for want of food. Pitying their distress, he ordered meal to be spread on the ground, when the locusts, having refreshed themselves, flew away. Some days after this incident, he reached a thick forest, crowded with elephants and herds of wild animals of every description. But as they did not attempt to attack him, and were in a starving condition, he ordered some of his cattle to be killed and distributed to them for food. Having satisfied themselves, they retired, showing every sign that dumbness would allow of being pleased with his kind treatment. On his march onwards, the prince met a venerable old man, of whom he inquired the route to the territories of Amir bin Nauman, and was informed that they were at no great distance, but only to be entered by a range of rugged and steep mountains composed of iron stone, and next to impassable. Also, that should he succeed in overcoming this difficulty, it was in vain to hope to attain the princess. The prince inquiring the reason, the old man continued, Sultan Amir bin Nauman has resolved that no one shall wed his daughter unless he can perform 3 tasks which he will impose, and these are of so difficult a nature as not to be executed by the labor or ingenuity of man, and many unhappy princes have lost their heads in the attempt, for he puts them to death instantly on failure, Be advised, therefore, and give up so fruitless an expedition." The prince, instead of listening to the admonition of the old man, resolved to proceed, and having requested his prayers and benedictions, continued his march. In a short time, having entered the passes of the mountains, he discovered vast caverns inhabited by a species of genii, who were employed in working upon masses of iron stone, which they dug from the rock. The prince having entertained them with a hospitable feast, they in return showed him the easiest route through the stupendous mountains, and he at length arrived in safety before the capital of Sultan Amir bin Naumun, to whom he sent an envoy, requesting leave to encamp on the plain, and to offer himself as a candidate for the beautiful princess, his daughter. The Sultan, in reply, acceded to his petition, and invited him to the palace, where, in the evening, he was led into a court, in which was placed an immense vessel filled with 3 kinds of grain mixed together, which, as his first task towards obtaining the princess, he was to separate entirely from each other, and put into 3 heaps, which if not accomplished before sunrise, he was then to forfeit his head in punishment for his temerity. It being now too late to recede, the prince resigned himself to Providence, and the gates of the court being locked upon him, he prayed to Allah and began to separate the grains. But finding his progress vain, his spirits deserted him about midnight, and he left off his fruitless labor in despair, endeavoring to reconcile himself to death. While he was praying for fortitude to bear him up in his last moments, a voice was heard saying, "Be comforted, and receive the reward of thy charity to famished insects." Immediately after this, the heavens were obscured as if by thick clouds, which descended on the court, when, lo! this phenomenon proved to be myriads of locusts, who, alighting on the vessel, in a few hours emptied it of all the grain, which they disposed of, each in its kind, in 3 several heaps, and having given a general buzzing of salutation, took flight and vanished into the air. The prince was overjoyed at the miraculous accomplishment of his task by the grateful locusts, and having offered up thanks to Allah and the Prophet for his deliverance from impending destruction, composed himself to rest, doubting not but that they would assist him to overcome the 2 remaining labors. Great was the surprise of the Sultan Amir bin Naumun, when, on coming at daylight to the court, he beheld his intended victim in a profound sleep, and the grain in 3 separate heaps, neatly piled up in the form of domes. The prince, awaking, saluted him, and demanded to be informed of his next task, but the Sultan put him off to the evening, until when he entertained him at the palace with a most magnificent feast, and his obdurate heart was so softened by the noble address and demeanor of his guest, that he wished he might be able to overcome the remaining impositions and become his son-in-law. The princess also, who had the curiosity to look at him through the blinds of her apartments, was so fascinated with his appearance that she prayed for his success. When night had set in, the prince was conducted to an open plain in front of the palace, in the center of which was a large reservoir full of clear water, which the Sultan commanded him to drain off before sunrise, or forfeit his life. The prince remained alone on the brink of the reservoir, with rather somewhat more hope of success than he had felt of overcoming his task of the preceding night. Nor was he disappointed, for about midnight a voice was heard exclaiming, "Prince, benevolence is never unrequited." And lo, the plain was filled with elephants, rhinoceroses, camels, dromedaries, lions, tigers, and every species of wild beasts, in such immense droves as could not be numbered, who, advancing in turn to the reservoir, drank in such quantity that it at length was completely emptied, and became as dry as if just finished. The beasts, then expressing pleasure by their varying natural noises at having served their benefactor, departed, and left him to enjoy the deliverance from the labor imposed upon him. The prince, now more assured than ever that he was the favorite of Allah and the Prophet, after offering up prayers with a relieved heart, slept comfortably in a building creeled on the margin of the reservoir, and was only awakened by the call of the Sultan at sunrise, who was more astonished at the accomplishment of this labor than the former, though certainly each was equally difficult. He conducted the prince to his palace, and the day was spent in the highest festivity. At the approach of night, the prince was conducted to his third task, which was to complete and fit up before daylight from a vast mass of planks of the choicest timber ready stored the doors, windows, and balconies of an unfinished palace, much larger than that which the Sultan inhabited. The prince, at the apprehension of the consequences of failure, was somewhat alarmed, but the recollection of his former aid supported him, and after offering up his devotions, he sat down, composedly waiting for the decision of Providence on his fate. His resignation was accepted, for at midnight he was roused from his contemplations by the sounds of sewing, planing, hammering, nailing, and the songs of happy workmen. Looking up, he perceived his friends of the Iron Mountains, who, all saluting him, cried out, "Prince, set your heart at rest, for we are come to repay you for your hospitable feast." Before daylight the palace was fitted up in a manner more elegant than can be described, and every door, window, and balcony painted with the most brilliant colors, flowered with silver and gold. The grateful laborers of the Iron Mountains, having finished their work, respectfully saluted the prince and departed. The prince, having taken a grateful leave of his useful friends, walked through the palace, and was eagerly employed in admiring its elegance and the magnificence of their finishing hand, when the Sultan, Amir bin Nauman, who from his apartments at sunrise had observed the miraculous completion, appeared, having hastened to examine the superb workmanship and to congratulate his son-in-law, for as such he now acknowledged him, and as the favored of Allah and of the last of prophets. He conducted the prince to the palace, and the most magnificent preparations being made, the nuptials with his daughter were celebrated in the new edifice, where the bride and bridegroom enjoyed themselves for 3 months, at the expiration of which the prince begged permission to return to his father's dominions, which he reached just in time to release him from the attack of an inimical sultan who had invaded the country and laid close siege to his capital. His father received him with rapture, and the prince, having made an apology to the sultana for his former rude behavior, she received his excuses, and having no child of her own, readily adopted him as her son, so that the royal family lived henceforth in the utmost harmony till the death of the sultan and sultana, when the prince succeeded to the empire. End of section 36.
M. Bradley Peters. The Arabian Nights Entertainment, Volume 4. Translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 37. Story of the Lovers of Syria, or The Heroine. There formerly dwelt in the city of Damascus 2 brothers, one poor and the other rich, the former of whom had a son, and the latter a daughter. The poor man, dying, left his son, just emerging from infancy, to the protection of his wealthy uncle, who behaved to his unfortunate charge with paternal tenderness, till the youth, who had exchanged vows of love with his cousin, requested her in marriage, when the father refused and expelled him from his house. The young lady, however, who had ardently loved him, agreed to elope, and having one night escaped from her father's dwelling, repaired to the object of her affection, who, having notice of her intentions, had prepared 2 horses and a mule to carry their baggage. They traveled all night, and by morning reached a seaport, where they found a ship ready to sail, in which, having secured a passage, the lady immediately embarked, but the lover remained on shore to dispose of the horses. While he was seeking for a purchaser in the market, a fair wind sprung up, and the master of the ship, having weighed anchor, hoisted sail and departed, the lady in vain entreating him to wait the return of her beloved, or send her on shore, for he was captivated with her beauty. Finding herself thus ensnared, as she was a woman of strong mind, instead of indulging in unavailing complaint, she assumed a satisfied air, and as the only way to preserve her honor, received the addresses of her treacherous master with pretended complacency, and consented to receive him as a husband at the first port at which the ship might touch. With these assurances he was contented, and behaved to her with honorable deference and affectionate respect. At length the vessel anchored near a city, to which the captain went to make preparation for his marriage. But the lady, while he was on shore, addressed the ship's crew, setting forth with such force his treacherous conduct to herself, and offering such rewards if they would convey her to her lover at the port they had left, that the honest sailors were moved in her favor, agreed to obey her as their mistress, and, hoisting sail, left the master to shift for himself. After some days of favorable weather, a contrary gale blowing hard, the vessel was driven far out of her course, and for shelter obliged to anchor at the first haven that offered, which proved to be that of a large city, the capital of a potent sultan, whose officers came on board to examine the vessel, and inquire into her cargo and destination. These men, to their great surprise, finding it commanded by a lady of exquisite beauty, reported her charms to the sultan, who resolved to possess them, and sent her an offer of marriage, to which she seemingly consented, and the sultan commanded the most splendid preparations to be made for the nuptials. When all was ready, he sent on board the vessel the daughter of his vizier, with other ladies, 39 in number, magnificently attired, to wait upon his bride and attend her on shore. They were graciously received by the politic lady, and invited to refresh themselves in the grand cabin, which she had elegantly adorned with costly hangings, and prepared in it a superb collation, to which they sat down. She then dismissed the boats in which they came, sending a message to the sultan that she should entertain the ladies on board till the next morning, when she would repair on shore and conclude their marriage. She behaved towards her new guests with such winning affability, that they one and all admired their expected sultana, and partook of the entertainment with the highest satisfaction. But what was their surprise, when in the middle of the night she commanded the crew to weigh anchor, having first warned them, on pain of her displeasure and immediate death, to keep silence, and raise no alarm in the harbor. The vessel sailed and put to sea without being molested, when the intrepid commandress consoled the affrighted ladies, related to them her own adventures, and assured them that when she should have rejoined her lover, they should, if they choose, be honorably restored to their homes. But in the meantime, she hoped they would contentedly share her fortunes. This behavior, by degrees, so won upon their minds that the lady forgot their sorrows, became pleased with their situation, and in short time were so attached to their new mistress that they would not have left her had it been in their power. After some weeks' sail, it became necessary to steer towards the first coast that should present itself, to lay in a supply of fresh water and provisions. And, land appearing, the vessel anchored, when the lady and her companions went on shore. Here they were surrounded by 40 robbers, who threatened to take them prisoners, when the heroic lady, desiring her friends to conceal their fears, assumed a smiling countenance, and, addressing the chief of the banditti, assured him that there would be no occasion for force, as she and her companions were ready to share their love, being women who were above the prejudice of their sex, and had devoted themselves to pleasure, in search of which they roved on board their vessel from one coast to another, and would now stay with them as long as they might wish for their company. This declaration suiting the depraved minds of the robbers, they laid aside their fierce looks and warlike weapons, bringing abundance of all sorts of provisions to regale their expected mistresses, with whom they sat down to a plentiful repast, which was heightened by a store of wines which the lady had brought in her boats from the ship. Mirth and jollity prevailed, but the fumes of the liquors, in which the politic lady had infused strong opiates, suddenly operated upon their senses, and they fell down one and all in a state of stupefaction. She then, with her companions, drew the sabres of their brutal admirers and put them all to death, excepting the chief, whom they bound hand and foot with strong cords, and after cutting off his beard and mustachios, tied his own cimeter around his neck, leaving him to feel mortification worse than death on the recovery of his senses, namely, the sight of his slaughtered fellows, and regret at the loss of his imagined happiness. The ladies then stripped the caves of the robbers of the vast wealth which they had hoarded up from their plunders, and having carried it on board their boats with a stock of water and provisions, returned to the ship, weighed anchor, and sailed triumphant and rejoicing from such a dangerous coast. After some weeks' sail, they descried land, to which they approached and discovered a spacious harbor, around which rose a vast city, the buildings of which were sublimely lofty, adorned with flights of marble steps to the water's edge, and crowned with domes of minarets, topped with pinnacles of gold. The enterprising lady, having anchored, clothed herself and her companions in magnificent male habits, after which she ordered the boats to be hoisted out, and they were rowed ashore by part of the crew richly dressed. On landing, they all found the inhabitants of the city in mourning, and making doleful lamentation for their late sultan, who had died only a few days before. The gallant appearance of a stranger so nobly attended created much surprise, and intelligence of the arrival was instantly conveyed to the vizier, who acted as a regent till the election of a new monarch, which ceremony was just on the point of taking place. The minister, who thought he perceived in such a critical arrival the work of fate, immediately waited on the now supposed prince, whom he invited to be present at the election, at the same time informing him that when in this kingdom a sultan died without issue, the laws appointed that his successor should be chosen by the alighting of a bird on his shoulder, which bird would be let fly among the crowd assembled in the square before the palace. The seeming prince accepted the invitation, and with the disguised ladies was conducted to a gorgeous pavilion, open on all sides to view the ceremony. The ominous bird, being loosened from his chain, soared into the air to a great height, then gradually descending, flew round and round the square repeatedly, even with the faces of the spectators. At length it darted into the pavilion, where the lady and her companions were seated, fluttered around her head, and at length rested upon her shoulder, giving at the same time a cry of exultation, stretching its neck and flapping its wings. Immediately upon this, the viziers and courtiers bowed themselves to the ground, and the assembled crowd prostrated themselves on the earth, crying out, "Long live our glorious Sultan, the chosen of Providence, the elected by the decrees of fate!" The disguised lady was instantly conducted to the palace, seated on a splendid throne, and proclaimed amidst the acclamations of the people sovereign of an extensive empire. Nor were the abilities of her mind unequal to the task of government. In a few days, the vizier offered to the supposed sultan his daughter in marriage, and his offer being accepted, the nuptials were celebrated with the utmost magnificence. But what was the astonishment of the bride, when instead of being caressed, the sultan, on retiring with her, became cold and reserved, rose from her, and spent the night in prayer. In the morning the sultana was questioned by her mother, who, on her relating the behavior of her husband, observed that possibly, from his youth, he might be over-reserved, but that love would naturally in time operate its effect. Several evenings passed in the same manner, when the bride, mortified at such coldness, could no longer restrain herself, and said, "Why, my lord, if you disliked me, did you take me to wife? But if you love me not as other men, tell me so, and I will suffer my misfortune in silence." The lady, moved by this remonstrance, replied, "Most virtuous princess, would that for your sake I were of the sex you suppose me. But alas, I am like you, a woman, disappointed in love." She then related to her the wonderful adventure she had undergone since leaving her father's house, at which the vizier's daughter was so affected that she vowed for her a lasting friendship, agreed to keep her secret, and live with her till such times as chance should restore her lover. In return for this kindness, the lady promised that should the object of her affections ever arrive, he should marry them both, and that she should have the precedence in the ceremony of the union. The two friends having thus agreed, the vizier's daughter regained her cheerfulness, and means were taken to convince her father, mother, and friends of the consummation of the nuptials. From this time they lived in perfect happiness together, one exercising the authority of the Sultan to the satisfaction of the subject, and the other acting the part of a satisfied and obedient wife. But still both were anxious to meet their mutual husband. As the capital of the kingdom was a mart for most nations of the world, the pretended Sultan formed the following stratagem for discovering her beloved. Not doubting but he would travel all over parts of the world in search of the object of his affection, she erected a most magnificent caravanserai, furnished with baths hot and cold, and every convenience for the weary traveler. When it was finished, she issued a proclamation that sojourners from all parts should be welcome to lodge in it, and be provided with every necessary till they could accommodate themselves in the city, or pursued, if only travelers, their journeys to another part. Over the gate of this edifice she placed an exact statue of herself, and gave orders to the guards that whatever stranger, on looking at it, should show signs of agitation, or utter words signifying that he knew the original, should be immediately seized and confined in the palace. Many weeks had not passed when the father of this enterprising lady, who had traveled many thousands of miles in search of his daughter, arrived at the gate, and on seeing the statue exclaimed, "Alas, alas, how like my poor lost child!" He was immediately carried to the palace, lodged in a magnificent apartment, treated with the highest respect, but kept in complete ignorance to the cause of his confinement and his future fate. Not long after this, his disconsolate nephew, who, on the departure of the treacherous captain, had wandered from city to city in hopes of finding his mistress, arrived and repaired to the caravanserai. On sight of the statue, his feelings overcame him. He sighed and fainted, when he was taken up by the guards and lodged in the palace, where, being come to himself, he was astonished at the respect and attention paid him by the domestics, and the splendid manner in which he was entertained. But it was in vain that he inquired the cause of his detention, the only answer he could get being, "Have patience, my lord, and repose yourself, till Providence shall free you from our confinement." Soon after this, the master of the ship, who had visited port after port in hopes of recovering his vessel, reached the city, and hearing of the hospitality with which all strangers were received at the caravanserai of the Sultan, repaired to the gateway. But no sooner had he cast his eyes on the statue than he exclaimed, "Ah, how like the artful yet virtuous woman who cheated me of my property by stealing my ship!" Immediately he was seized by the guards, and conveyed to the palace, but treated with kindness. Many days had not succeeded to this event, when the Sultan and the vizier, whose daughter with the 39 ladies had been so artfully carried away from them by the enterprising heroine of this history, made their appearance at the gateway of the caravanserai, and, on beholding the statue, cried out, "Surely this is the likeness of those who deprived us of our children. Oh, that we could find her and revenge on her hypocrisy!" On saying this, they were apprehended and taken to the palace, where they were conducted to the apartments suitable to their rank. And a few days afterwards, the chief of the banditti, who, burning with the ireful resolution of revenging the deaths of his associates, had traveled from place to place in hopes of finding the object of his fury, arriving at the gateway and observed the statue, roared out in a rage, "Surely this is the resemblance of my tormentor. Oh, that I could meet the original, so that I might have the satisfaction of making her blood atone for the murder of my friends." Instantly as he had spoken, the guards at the gate, rushing upon him, bound him hand and foot, conveyed him to the palace, where he was confined in a loathsome dungeon, and fed on the coarsest viands. The pretended Sultan, having now all the parties in her power, one morning ascended her throne in full audience, and commanded them to be brought before her. When they had made their obeisance, she commanded them to relate the cause of their having journeyed to her capital, but the royal presence rendered them incapable of uttering a word, upon which she exclaimed, "Since you cannot speak, I will," and then discovered, to their astonished minds, the adventures of each, which had occasioned their traveling. She then discovered herself, and fell upon the necks of her father and lover, with whom she retired into the private apartments. The Sultan and his vizier were made happy in the company of the daughter of the latter and the other ladies. The master of the ship, as his troubles had atoned for his irregular behavior, was received into favor, and had his vessel restored. But the savage chief of the banditti was put to death, by being cast into a burning pile, that no further injury might be offered to mankind. In a few days, the most magnificent preparations being made, the double nuptials of the heroic lady and her friend the vizier's daughter were celebrated with her constant lover. to whom she resigned her throne, and the happy wives lived together in felicity, undisturbed by jealousy of the husband's attention to either, so equally did they share his love. The Sultan and Vizier, after being long entertained at the court, took leave and returned under an escort to their own country. But the daughter and the 39 ladies could not be prevailed upon to accompany them, only to visit and bid farewell to their parents. For such was their attachment to their gallant mistress, that they came back immediately, and were espoused to the principal nobles of her court. Years of unusual happiness passed over the heads of the fortunate adventurers of this story, until death, the destroyer of all things, conducted them to a grave which must one day be the resting place for the ages of us all, till the receiving angel shall sound his trumpet. End of section 37. Recording by M. Bradley Peters.
Arabian Nights Entertainments, Vol.4, translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 38. The Story of Hajjaj, the tyrannical governor of Kufa, and the young Syed. As Hajjaj, the Umayyad Caliph, was one day seated in his hall of audience, surrounded by his nobles and dependents, tremblingly awaiting his commands, for his countenance resembled that of an enraged lion, there suddenly entered unceremoniously into the assembly a beardless youth of noble but sickly aspect, arrayed in tattered garments, for misfortune had changed his original situation, and poverty had withered the freshness of his opening youth. He made the customary obeisance to the governor, who returned his salute and said, "Who art thou, boy? What hast thou to say? And wherefore hast thou intruded thyself into the company of princes, as if thou were invited? Who art thou, and of whom art thou the son?" "Of my father and mother," replied the youth. "But how earnest thou here?" "In my clothes." "From whence?" "From behind me." "Where art thou going?" "Before me." "Upon what dost thou travel?" "Upon the earth." Wajih, vexed at the pertness of the youth, exclaimed, "Quit this trifling, and inform me whence thou comest." "From Egypt." "Art thou from Cairo?" "Why askest thou?" said the boy. "Because," replied Wajih, "her stands are of gold, and her river Nile miraculously fruitful. But her women are wanton, free to every conqueror, and her men unstable." "I am not from thence, but from Damascus," cried the youth. "Then," said Hajjaj, "thou art of the most rebellious place, filled with wretched inhabitants, a wavering race, neither Jews nor Christians." "But I am not from thence," replied the youth, "but from Khorasan." "That is a most impure country," said Hajjaj, "whose religion is worthless. For the inhabitants are, of all barbarians, the most savage, plunderers of flocks. They know not mercy, their poor are greedy, and their rich men misers." "I am not of them," cried the youth, "but Mosul." "Then," exclaimed Hajjaj, "thou art of an unnatural and adulterous race, whose Jews are catamites, and whose old men are obstinate as asses." "But I am from Yemen," said the boy. "If so," answered the tyrant, "thou belongest to a comfortless region, where the most honorable profession is robbery, where the middling ranks tan hides, and where wretched poor spin wool and weave coarse mantles." "But I am from Mecca," said the boy. "Then," replied Hajjaj, "thou comest from a mine of perverseness, stupidity, ignorance, and slothfulness. For from among its people God raised up his prophet, whom they disbelieved, rejected, and forced away to a strange nation, who loved, venerated, and assisted him in spite of the men of Mecca. But whence comest thou, youth? For thy pertness is become troublesome, and my inclination leads me to punish thee for thy impertinence." "Had I been assured that thou durst kill me," cried the youth, "I should not have appeared before thee. But thou canst not." "Woe unto thee, rash boy!" exclaimed Hajjaj. "Who is he that can prevent my executing thee instantly?" To thee be thy woe, replied the youth. He can prevent thee who directs man and his innermost thoughts, and who never falsifieth his gracious promise. He it is, called the tyrant, who instigates me to put thee to death. Withhold thy blaspheming, replied the youth. It is not God, but Satan that prompts thy mind to my murder. And with God I hope for refuge from the accursed. But know that I am from the glorious Medina, the seat of religion, virtue, respectability, and honor, descended from the race of Ben Ghalib, and the family of Ali, son of Abu Talib, whom God has glorified and approved, and will protect all his posterity, which you would extirpate. But you cannot root it out, for it will flourish even to the last day of the existence of this world. The tyrant was now overcome with rage, and commanded the youthful Said to be slain. But his nobles and officers interceded for him, saying, while they bowed their necks before him, Pardon, pardon, behold our heads and our lives, a ransom for his. For God's sake, accept our intercession, O Amir, for this youth is not deserving of death. Forbear your entreaties, exclaimed the tyrant, for were an angel to cry from heaven, Do not slay him, I would not attend. Upon this the young Said said, Thou ravest, O Hajjujah. Who art thou, that an angel should be commissioned for thy sake? The tyrant, struck with his magnanimity, became calm, and commanding the executioner to release the youth, said, For the present I forbear, and will not kill thee unless thy answers to my further question shall deserve it. Then he entered on the following dialogue, Hajjujah hoping to entrap him in discourse. How can the creature approach the perfection of the Almighty? By prayer, by fasting, by the commanded alms, by pilgrimage, and fighting for the cause of God. I serve him by shedding the blood of infidel man. You pretend that Hassan and Hussein, your ancestors, were descendants of the Prophet. But how can that be, when God has declared in the Koran Muhammad was not of your obstinate race, but the prophet of God, and last of divine messengers? Hear the answer to that in the verse following it. Quote, Hath not a prophet come unto you of your own nation? Receive him, and from what he hath forbidden, be forbidden. End quote. Surely then, God hath forbidden the shedding of the blood of him who he sanctified. Thou hast spoken justly, young man, but inform me what God hath daily and nightly commanded us as obligatory to do. To pray 5 times. What to observe in each year. To keep the month of Ramzan as a fast. What to perform in the course of life. To make a pilgrimage to Mecca, the temple of God. Truly said. But what hath most dignified and enlightened Arabia? The tribe of Quraysh. Wherefore? Because of our holy prophets being a member of it. Who are the most skilled in horsemanship in all Arabia, the most valiant, and of best conduct in war? The tribe of Hashim. Why think you so? Because my grandfather, Imam Ali, son of Abu Talib, was one of it. What tribe of Arabs is most famous for benevolence and celebrated for liberality? The family of Tai. Wherefore? Because Hatim belonged to it. Which of the tribes have been most disgraceful to Arabia, and the most oppressive to its inhabitants? The tribe of Sukif. Why so? Because thou belongest to it. The tyrant could scarcely now contain his anger, but said, hoping to cut the youth off from reply, Tell me, is a Capricorn of the heavens male or female? To which he answered, Shew me its tail, that I may inform thee. The tyrant laughed, and continued his questions as follows. Wert thou ever in love? Yes, completely immersed in it. With whom? With my God, who will, I trust, pardon me for my errors, and deliver me from thee this day. Knowest thou thy God? Yes. By what means? By the scriptures, which he caused to descend to his prophet. Dost thou guard the Koran? Does it fly from me that I should guard it? What dost thou learn from it? That God commanded its rules to be obeyed. Hast thou read and understood it? Yes. If so, tell me first, what passage in it is most sublime? Secondly, which most commanding? Thirdly, which most just? Fourthly, which most alarming? Fifthly, which most encouraging? Sixthly, that which Jews and Christians both believe in. Seventhly, that in which God has spoken purely of himself, that where he speaks of the angels, that in which he mentions the prophets, that where he alludes to those destined to paradise, and that in which he speaks of those devoted to hell, that which includes 10 points, and that which Iblis the accursed delivered. By God's help I will answer thee. The most sublime passage is the Kursi. The most commanding, God insisteth on justice. The most just, whoever diminishes the least of a measure, God will requite him doubly, and the same to whoever addeth the least. The most alarming, all expect to enter paradise. The most encouraging, O my servants who have mortified yourselves, despair not of the mercy of God. That in which are 10 points, God created the heavens and the earth, the revolutions of night and day, also the firmament over the waters, that it might profit man. That which is believed alike by Jews and Christians, the Jew saith that the Christian is in error, and the Christian saith that the Jew is mistaken. They both believe so, and both are in error. That in which God hath spoken purely of himself, I have not created genii and men, but to worship me. That in which he speaks of the angels, they said, We have no knowledge, but what thou hast taught us, for thou only art wise and all-knowing. That which speaks of the prophets, how could we deliver you a verse without the order of God, on whom the faithful will rely? That which mentions the devoted to hell, God hath cast us down from heaven, for we were transgressors. That which describes the blessed, praise be God, who hath divested us of all sorrow, for the Lord is merciful and gracious. That which Satan spoke, none will profit by thy mercy, but thy servants the blessed. A Juge involuntarily exclaimed, Praise be God, who giveth wisdom to whom it pleaseth him. But I have found none so learned of such tender age. Having thus spoken, he put many other questions to the youth in every science, and he answered them so readily that the tyrant was overcome with admiration, and offered him a residence at his court. But the young man declined it, and requested his dismission, which he granted, conferring upon him a beautiful female slave, richly habited, 1,000 pieces of gold, and a steed elegantly caparisoned. The courtiers were astonished at the bounty of the tyrant, which he perceiving said, Be not surprised, for the advice he hath given me was worthy of reward, and cursed is he who doth not requite a sincere adviser, declareth our sacred Koran. End of section 38.
The Arabian Nights Entertainments, Vol.4, translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 39. Story of Inz al-Wujud and Weird al-Ikman, daughter of Ibrahim, vizier to Sultan Shamikh. Many ages past, there was a powerful sultan who had a vizier named Ibrahim, and this master had a daughter, the most beautiful of her sex and accomplished of her age, so that she became distinguished by the appellation of Weird al-Ikmam, or the rose among flowers. It was the custom of the Sultan Shamikh to hold annually a general assembly of all the nobles of his kingdom, and the persons eminent for science or the arts, during which they were magnificently entertained at the royal expense. The former displayed their prowess in martial exercises before the sovereign, and the latter in the productions of their genius and skill, when valuable prizes were bestowed upon the arbitration of the appointed judges on those who deserved them.
On one of the days of this festival, the vizier's daughter, from a latticed balcony of the palace in which she sat to view the sport, was so struck by the manly figure and agility of a young nobleman named Inz al-Wujud, or the perfection of human nature, that love took possession of her mind. She pointed him out to a female confidant, and gave her a letter to convey to the object of her affections. The young nobleman, who had heard her praises, was enraptured by his good fortune, and the next day, having obtained as full a sight of her beauties as could be had through the golden wires of the balcony, retired, overcome by love. Letters now passed daily and almost hourly between them, and they were impatient for a meeting, which was at length planned, but the note fixing the place and time was unfortunately dropped by the confidant, and carried to the vizier, who, alarmed for the honour of his family, sent his daughter the same night to a far distant castle belonging to himself, and situated on an island in a vast lake, surrounded by mountainous deserts, thinly inhabited. The unfortunate lady was obliged to submit to her fate, but before her departure contrived to write on the outside of her balcony the following words: "They are carrying me off, but I know not where." In the morning, her lover, repairing as usual in the hopes of seeing his mistress in the balcony, read the unwelcome intelligence, which for a time deprived him of his senses. When he somewhat recovered, he resolved to leave the court, though then the chief favourite of the Sultan, and go in search of his beloved. Having put on the habit of a wandering devotee, he on the following evening quitted the city, and recommending himself to Providence, set out, but knew not whither. Many weeks did he travel, but he could find no traces of his beloved object, when suddenly, passing through a thick forest, there met him a monstrous lion, from whom he thought it impossible to escape, and having uttered a prayer for the happiness of his beloved, and repeated the testimony of martyrdom, he resigned himself to his fate, and waited the spring of his expected devourer. What was his surprise when the majestic animal, instead of making him his prey, on approaching close to him, having looked compassionately in his face, licked his hands, and turning round, walked gently onwards, moving his head as if to signify the youth should follow him. Inz al-Wujud did so, and was conducted through the forest by the lion, who, ascending a high mountain, suddenly stopped at the entrance of a cave, to which was a door of iron, and then moving his head, and once more licking the hands of his companion, the generous animal left him, and retired back to the woods. The youth now went to the cave, and having knocked at the door, it was opened by a venerable hermit, who bade him welcome, brought him warm water to wash his feet, and set before him refreshments of various kinds. When he had eaten, he inquired the cause of his coming to such a desolate country, and Inz al-Wujud having related his adventures, the old man exclaimed, "Thou art a favourite of heaven, or the lion would have devoured thee. Despair not, therefore, of success, for my mind presages that thou wilt be happy, nor shalt thou want my assistance." Inz al-Wujud having thanked him for his hospitality and generous offers, the hermit informed him that for nearly 20 years past he had not beheld a human face till a few days prior to his coming, when wandering over the mountains he had seen an encampment on the margin of the great lake below, in which appeared a crowd of men and women, some very richly habited, part of whom had embarked on board a stately yacht, and the remainder having taken leave of them, struck their tents and returned by the road they had came. "Most probably," said the hermit, "the yacht may have conveyed thy mistress to the castle, which stands on an island in the middle of the lake, and if so, thou shalt soon be safely landed. For the rest, Providence must be thy guide. I will this night remember thee in my prayers, and meditate on what can be done for thy benefit." Having said this, the hermit conducted the wanderer to a chamber, and left him to his repose. The beautiful Weird al-Ikmam during this time remained overwhelmed with uneasiness in her confinement, and it was in vain that her attendants tried to amuse her. She wandered melancholy through the magnificent gardens of the castle, the groves of which were filled with every variety of birds, whose harmony was delightful, but the soft cooing of the turtle dove and the plaintive note of the lovelorn nightingale alone caught her attention. To these she would listen for hours together, reclined on a mossy bank, and fancy their pensive strains the language of her beloved. Such was her daily employment, nor would she quit the garden till forced by her attendants to take shelter from the falling dews of night. We now return to her lover. Fatigue and the consoling assurance of the friendly hermit had greatly composed the mind of Inz al-Wujood, who enjoyed a refreshing sleep. Nor did he awake till the sun was mounted high in the heavens, when he joined his venerable host in his devotions, after which they partook in a repast of bread, milk, and fresh fruits. This ended, the old man requested him to fetch from the forest a bundle of the filaments of palm bark, which when brought to him he plaited into a shape resembling a little boat, and giving it to Inz al-Wujood, said, "Repair to the lake, and put this into the water, when it will become instantly large enough to hold thee. Then embark in it, and trust to heaven for the rest. Farewell." Inz al-Wujood, having taken leave of his venerable friend the hermit, with many thanks, did as he had been commanded, and soon arrived on the margin of the lake, into which he launched his little vessel, when to his great surprise it instantaneously became a handsome boat with the sails set. He got into it, and a fair wind springing up was soon out of sight of land. For some days he was wafted over the deep, but at length the shore of an island appeared, on which he landed and made his boat fast to the trunk of a large tree. He then walked into the country, and found it beautifully interspersed with green meadows, clear streams, and shady groves of bending fruit trees, on the branches of which all sorts of birds were warbling in their different strains. Having refreshed himself with several fruits, he proceeded onwards, and at length came to the side of a superb edifice, to the gateway of which he advanced, but found it locked. For 3 days he waited in hopes of seeing some of its inhabitants, but in vain. However, on the 4th morning the gate was opened by a man, who, seeing Inz al-Wujood, advanced towards him, and inquired who he was, whence he came, and what was his reason for waiting at the gate. "I am of Ispahan," replied Inz al-Wujood, "and was shipwrecked in a trading voyage upon this coast, to the shore of which I alone of all my companions had the good fortune to escape." Upon hearing this, the man burst into tears, embraced him, and said, "May God preserve thee from future calamities. I am also a native of Ispahan, where also dwelt my cousin, whom I dearly loved, and by whom I was beloved. At this happy period of my youth, a nation stronger than ours made war against us, overcame us, and among other captives forced me from my country, after which they sold me as a slave to my present master. But come, my dear countryman, enter the palace, and repose thyself in my apartment, where we shall endeavour to console each other under our misfortunes, till Providence shall restore us to our homes." Inz al-Wujood gladly accepted such a friendly invitation, and on entering the court beheld a lofty and wide-spreading tree, from the branches of which were suspended several golden cages, each inhabited by a beautiful bird, and each striving to revile the other in melody, as if in welcome of his approach. He inquired of his host to whom the splendid edifice belonged, and was informed to the vizier of Sultan Shamikh, who, to secure his daughter from the vicissitudes of fortune, had lodged her here, and only visited her annually to inquire after her health, and bring her the necessary supplies for her convenience and the support of her attendants in the castle. Upon hearing the above circumstances, Inz al-Wujood was nearly overcome with ecstasy, but restraining his feelings, exclaimed to himself, "At length I have reached the abode of my beloved, and may hope for success," which was yet, however, afar off. His charming mistress, little thinking that her lover was so near, and weary of absence and the solitude of her abode, had that very evening resolved to escape from confinement. In the darkness of the night she accordingly let herself down from the battlements by a silken rope, which she had twisted from the slips of various robes, and reached the ground unhurt. With haste she fled towards the seashore, where she perceived a fishing boat, the owner of which, though at first alarmed, supposing her, from her dazzling appearance, for she was covered with jewels, to be an ensnaring genie, at length, on her assurances that she was really a woman, admitted her into his vessel. She thanked him for his kindness, which she rewarded by the gift of many rich jewels, and requested to be conveyed across the lake. The fisherman hoisted the sail, and for some hours the wind was prosperous. But now a heavy tempest arose, which tossed them constantly in imminent danger for 3 days, and drove them far from their intended course. At length the gale subsided, the sea became assuaged, and land appeared. As they approached the shore, a stately city rose to their view, the buildings of which seemed unusually magnificent. Under the terrace of the Sultan's palace they safely at last cast anchor, and it chanced that the prince, who was named Dara, was then sitting with his daughter in the balcony to enjoy the fresh sea breeze, and the view of the extensive harbour crowded with the vessels of every country. Perceiving the boat, the Sultan commanded his officers to bring the master and his crew to the presence. Great was his surprise at the introduction of the beautiful Weird al-Ikmam. From her rich dress, dignified air, and demeanour, he had concluded her to be of superior rank, and having seated her near his daughter, he graciously requested to be informed of the name of her country, and the cause of her having travelled to his capital, to which she replied in eloquent language, giving a summary detail of all her adventures. The Sultan consoled her by encouraging assurances of his protection, promised to exert his authority to the effect of a union with her beloved, and immediately dispatched his vizier with costly presents to the Sultan of Shamik, requesting him to send Inz al-Wujud to his court. The vizier, after a prosperous voyage, having reached the capital of the Sultan Shamik, presented his offerings and made known the request of his master, to which the Sultan replied that nearly a year had elapsed since Inz al-Wujud had, to his great regret, absented himself from his court, nor had any tidings been obtained of the place of his retirement, but that he would order his vizier to accompany the ambassador in search of his retreat, being willing to oblige his master the Sultan to the utmost of his power. Accordingly, after a repose of some days, the two viziers departed in search of Inz al-Wujud, but without knowledge where to bend their journey. At length they reached the shore of the ocean of Kunuz, on which they embarked in a hired vessel and sailed to the mountainous island of Tukala, of which the vizier of the Sultan of Shamik gave to his companion the following account. This island was some ages back inhabited by a genie, a princess of whom became violently enamoured of a handsome young man, a son of an emir of the city of Mysore, or Cairo, whom she beheld in her flight sleeping in his father's garden in the heat of the day. She sat down by him, having gently awoke him. The youth, on looking up, to his astonishment and rapture, saw a most beautiful damsel who courted his addresses. He was not backward in offering them, and mutual protestations of love and constancy took place. After some hours of happiness, the genie princess took an affectionate leave, promising soon to visit him again, and vanished from sight. The youth remained musing on his fortunate adventure till the dews of night began to fall, when his parents, fearful of some injury, sent attendants to conduct him to their palace, but he refused to go, and talked, as it appeared to them, so incoherently concerning his beloved, that they thought him distracted, seized him roughly, and forced him homewards. His father and mother were so alarmed, it was in vain that they courted him to partake of refreshment. He was sullen and gloomy, and at length abruptly retired to his chamber, where he remained in restless anxiety all night, waiting impatiently for morning, that he might revisit the happy spot where his charmer had promised to meet him again. The two viziers now disembarked and proceeded up the island. But what was the astonishment and mortification of Ibrahim on learning, when he arrived at the palace, that his daughter had escaped, nor had the attendants heard of her since her departure, though they had repeatedly searched every quarter of the island. Perceiving among his attendants whom he had left at the palace a strange young man of pallid countenance, wasted frame, and melancholy air, the vizier inquired how he had come among them, and received the reply that he was a shipwrecked merchant of Ispahan, whom they had taken in for charity. Ibrahim now requested of the vizier of the Sultan of Dara that he would return to his master and inform him of the vain search after Inz al-Wujud, at the same time desiring him to receive into the suite the supposed merchant as far as the city of Ispahan, which lay in his route. To this the vizier of Sultan Dara consented, and the two ministers, having taken a friendly leave of each other, separated and departed for their several capitals. The vizier of Sultan Dara, in the course of the journey, became so pleased with the agreeable manners of the supposed merchant that he often conversed with him familiarly, and at length the young man, emboldened by his condescending attention, ventured to inquire the cause of his travels to regions so distant from his own country, upon which he was informed of the arrival of the beautiful Weird al-Ikmam at the court of Sultan Dara, of the compassion of that sultan for her misfortune, his generous protection, and his own fruitless mission in search of her lover, Inz al-Wujud. At this happy intelligence, the latter, overcome with ecstasy, could no longer contain himself, but discovered who he was, and the vizier was also overjoyed at knowing, when least expected, that he had found the despaired object of his long journey. He embraced the young man, congratulated him upon the speedy termination of his absence from his beloved, and the happy union which awaited him. He then made him an inmate of his own tents, supplied him with rich attire, and every necessary becoming the condition of a person for whose fortunes he knew his sovereign to be so highly concerned. Inz al-Wujud, now easy in mind and renovated by the happy prospects before him, daily recovered health and strength, so that by the time of their arrival at the capital of Sultan Dara he had regained his pristine manliness and vigour. When the vizier waited upon his master, the Sultan Dara, to communicate his successful commission, the sultan commanded the youth to his presence. Inz al-Wujud performed the usual obeisance of kissing the ground before the throne, with the graceful demeanour of one who had been used to a court. The sultan graciously returned his salutation, and commanded him to be seated, after which he requested him to relate his adventures, which he did in eloquent language, interspersing his narrative poetical quotation and extempore verses applicable to the various incidents and situations. The sultan was charmed with his story, and when he had finished his relation, sent for the cauzee and witnesses to tie the marriage knot between the happy Inz al-Wujud and the beautiful Weird al-Ikmam, at the same time dispatching a messenger to announce the celebration of the nuptials to Sultan Shamikh and Ibrahim his adviser, who were bewailing their supposed irrecoverable losses, one that of his favourite, and the latter that of his daughter. Sultan Dara detained the happy couple at his court for some time, after which he dismissed them with valuable presents to their own country, which they reached in safety, and were received with the most heartfelt rejoicings by the sultan and the repentant vizier, who now recompensed them by his kindness for the former cruelty of his behaviour towards them, so that in favour with the sultan and happy in their own family, the lovers henceforth enjoyed every earthly felicity, sweetened by the reflection on their past distresses, till the angel of death summoned them to submit to the final destination of mortality. End of section 39. Recording by Annie Mars.
Vol.4, translated by Jonathan Scott. Section 40, The Adventures of Mazen of Khorasan, Part 1. In ancient days, there resided in the city of Khorasan a youth named Mazen, who, though brought up by his mother, a poor widow, to the humble occupation of a dyer, was so celebrated for his personal accomplishments and capacity as to become the admiration of crowds, who daily flocked to his shop to enjoy the pleasure of his conversation. This young man was as good as he was able, nor did flattery take away his humility, or make him dissatisfied with his laborious occupation, which he followed with industry unceasing, and maintained his mother and himself decently from the fruits of his labor. So delicate was his taste in the choice of colors that veils, turbans, and vests of Mazen's dyeing were sought after by all the young and gay Khorasan, and many of the females would often cast a wishful glance at him from under their veils as they gave him their orders. Mazen, however, was destined by fate not always to remain a dyer, but for higher fortunes and surprising adventures. As he was one day busy in his occupation, a man of Hijem came to his shop, and after looking at him earnestly for some moments, exclaimed, "Alas, that such a noble youth should be confined to drudge at so mean an employment." "I thank you, father, for your compassion," replied Mazen, "but honest industry can never be disgraceful." "True," said the old man of Hijem, "yet if Providence puts affluence and distinction in our way, should we refuse it?" "By no means," said Mazen. "Canst thou point me out the way to it, without making me forfeit my integrity? If so, I assure thee I am not so fond of my trade, but I would be glad to live at ease, in an honest manner, without it. For I should like to enjoy leisure, to follow my studies, which have already gained me some little celebrity." "Son," said the Hejimi, "thy wishes shall be satisfied. Thou hast no father, but I will be one to thee. From this instant I adopt thee as my son. I possess the art of transmuting common metals into gold. Be ready at thy shop early in the morning, when I will meet thee. Farewell." Having thus said, the old man took leave. Mazen's curiosity and ambition were raised. He shut up his shop sooner than usual, and returned with a full heart to his mother, to whom he communicated the offered kindness of the Hejimi. The good woman, after some moments of reflection, said, "Son, I fear some evil lurks under this apparent kindness, for we live in wicked days, when men profess more than they mean to do for the sake of attaining an object. Be cautious then, and do not, till thou hast proof of his sincerity, regard his office. We have at present all we want, and what can riches give more?" Mazen agreed to the propriety of his mother's advice, and promised to be wary. They ate their usual cheerful meal, and retired to rest. But the young man could sleep but little, and he longed with impatience for the morning that was to put him into possession of the art of transmuting metals into gold. The morning arrived, and Mazen repaired impatiently to his shop, where he had soon after the satisfaction of seeing his adopted father, who came bearing in his hands a crucible. "Welcome, son." "Welcome, father," was the mutual salutation, after which the Hejimi desired Mazen to kindle a fire. He did so, when the old man inquired of Mazen if he had any old metal, iron, brass, copper, etc. Mazen produced some pieces of an old pot of the latter metal, which were put into the crucible. When melted, the Hejimi took from his turban a paper containing powder of a yellowish hue, which he threw into the crucible, over which he repeated some cabalistic words, while he stirred the melting metal. At length he took it from the fire, and to his astonishment Mazen beheld a large lump of pure gold, which the Hejimi desired him to carry to a goldsmith's and get it exchanged for coin. He did so, and received a handsome sum, with which he returned to his adopted father. "Well, my son," said the Hejimi, "art thou now convinced of my skill, and my sincerity in offering to promote thy fortunes?" "I am," said Mazen, "and am ready to follow whatever thou choosest, in hopes of learning this invaluable secret." "That shall soon be thine," replied the transmuter of metals. "I will sup with thee this evening, and in the privacy of retirement give thee the necessary instruction." Mazen, overjoyed, immediately shut up his shop, and with his adopted father repaired to his own house, where he seated him in his best apartment. He then went to his mother, desiring that she would go and spend the night at a neighbor's, showing her the gold which his broken copper had procured as a proof of the sincerity of his new friend. The old lady no longer doubted upon such evidence, and cheerfully took leave and departed to a friend's house. Mazen next went to a cook's shop, from which he returned laden with every sort of refreshment. Nor was wine forgotten, though forbidden to the faithful. The adopted father and son ate heartily, at the same time pushing about the spirit-stirring liquor, till at last Mazen, who had not been used to drink wine, became intoxicated. The wily magician, for such in fact was his pretended friend, watched his opportunity, infused into the goblet of his unsuspecting host a certain potent drug, which Mazen had scarcely drunk off when he fell back upon his cushion, totally insensible. The treacherous wizard tumbled him into a large chest, and shutting the lid, locked it. He then ransacked the apartments of the house of everything portable worth having, which, with the gold, he put into another chest. Then, fetching in porters, he made them take up the chests and follow him to the seaside, where a vessel waited his orders to sail, and embarked with the unfortunate Mazen and his plunder. The anchor was weighed, and the wind being fair, the ship was soon out of sight of land. Mazen's mother, early in the morning, returning to her house, found the door open, her son missing, and the rooms ransacked of all her valuables. She gave a loud shriek, tore her hair, beat her bosom, and threw herself on the ground, crying out for her son, who she thought must have been murdered by the treacherous magician, against whose professions she had warned him to be cautious, till the sight of the transmuted gold had deceived her, as well as the unfortunate victim of his accursed arts. Some neighbors, hearing her lamentations, rushed in, lifted her from the ground, and inquired the cause of her distress, which, when informed of, they endeavored to alleviate by every consolation in their power, but in vain. The afflicted old lady was not to be comforted. She commanded a tombstone to be raised in the courtyard, over which she sat night and day bewailing her son, taking scarcely food sufficient to preserve her miserable existence. The infidel Hejemi, who was a wicked magician and a worshipper of fire, by name Bahram, hated the true believers, one of whom annually, for several years past, he had inveigled by his offers of instructing in the science of transmuting metals into his power, and after making him subservient to his purposes in procuring the ingredients necessary for his art, had treacherously put him to death, lest the secret should be divulged. Such was now his intention towards the unfortunate Mazen. On the evening of the second day after the sailing of the vessel, Bahram thought proper to awaken his victim to a sense of his misery. He opened the chest which had been placed in his cabin, and poured a certain liquid down the throat of Mazen, who instantly sneezed several times. Then, opening his eyes, gazed for some minutes wildly around him. At length, seeing the magician, observing the sea, and feeling the motion of the ship, his mind surmised to him the misfortune which had happened, and he guessed his having fallen into the snares of the treacherous Bahram, against which his mother had warned him, but in vain. Still, being a virtuous Mussulman, he would not complain against the decrees of heaven, and instead of lamentation uttered the following verse of the sacred Koran: "There is no support or refuge but from the Almighty, whose we are and to whom we must return. Deal gently with me, O my God, in the dictates of thy omnipotence, and make me resigned unto thy chastening, O Lord of all being." Having finished the above prayer, Mazen, turning humbly towards his accursed betrayer, said in a supplicating tone, "What hast thou done, my father? Didst thou not promise me enjoyment and pleasure?" The magician, after striking him with a scowling and a malignant sneer, exclaimed, "Thou dog, son of a dog, my pleasure is thy destruction. 39 such ill-devoted wretches as thyself have I already sacrificed, and thou shalt make the 40th victim to my enjoyment, unless thou wilt abjure thy faith and become like me a worshipper of the sacred fire, in which case thou shalt be my son, and I will teach thee the art of making gold. Cursed be thou, thy religion, and thy art, exclaimed the enraged Mazen. "God forbid that for the pleasures of this world I should apostatize from our holy prophet and give up the glorious rewards reserved in certain store for his faithful disciples. Thou mayest indeed destroy my body, but my soul despises thy torments. Vile dog, roared out the now furious sorcerer, I will try thy constancy." He then called in his slaves, who held Mazen on the floor of the cabin, while their abominable master beat him with a knotted whip till he was covered with a gore of blood. But the resolute youth, instead of complaining, uttered only prayers to heaven for divine support under his pangs, and strength of fortitude to acquire the glory of martyrdom. At length the magician, exhausted by his cruel exercise, desisted, and making his slaves load his unfortunate victim with heavy fetters, chained him down with only a coarse mat to lie upon in a dark closet, in which was placed some stinking water and coarse bread, just sufficient to keep up his miserable existence. Mazen's courage was not to be overcome. He washed his wounds and comforted himself with the hope that if he died he should enjoy the blisses of paradise, or if Providence had decreed his continuance in life, that the same Providence would present a mode of relief from his present and future afflictions. In this assurance he took a little of his wretched fare, and in spite of the agony of his wounds fell asleep, but only to awake to fresh misery. In the morning he was again persecuted by his cruel tormentor, who for 3 months daily harassed him with blows, with revilings, and every sort of insult that malice could invent or cruelty devise. Hitherto the wind had been fair, and the vessel had nearly reached the desired haven, when suddenly it changed, and a most tremendous storm arose. The waves threatened to swallow up or dash the vessel in pieces, so that all gave themselves over for lost. At this crisis the sailors, who believed that the tempest was sent by heaven as a judgment for their suffering the unfortunate Mazen to be so cruelly tormented, went in a body to the accursed Bahram, and accused him of having brought down the wrath of God upon the crew by his persecution of the young Mussulman, at the same time threatening to cast him overboard if he did not instantly release the youth from his confinement. To show the seriousness of their resolves, the sailors seized the slaves, who had been the instruments of the magician's cruelty, and threw them into the sea, which so alarmed the treacherous Bahram that he immediately released Mazen from his chains, fell at his feet, begging pardon for his hard usage and promising, if they escaped the storm, to conduct him safely to his own country, and fulfill his promise of instructing him in the secret of making gold. Wonderful to relate, but no sooner was Mazen freed from his fetters than the violence of the tempest lessened. By degrees the wind subsided, the waves abated their swell, and the sea no longer threatened to overwhelm them. In a few hours all was calm and security, and a prosperous gale enabled the shattered vessel to resume her course. The sailors, now regarding Mazen as one immediately befriended by heaven, treated him with the greatest respect and attention, and the hypocritical magician, pretending sorrow for his late cruelties, strove to procure his forgiveness and good opinion by every art of flattery and affected contrition, which had such an effect on the ingenuous youth that he forgot his treachery, and again believed his fair promises and assurances that the torments he had undergone had only been inflicted as trials of his constancy and belief in the true religion, virtues necessary to be proved before the grand secret of transmuting metals could be trusted to his keeping. The remainder of the voyage was prosperous and happy, and at the expiration of 3 months more, the vessel anchored on the wished-for coast, which was rocky, and the beach strewed with pebbles of every color. The magician, having given orders to the master of the vessel to wait a month for their return, disembarked with Mazen, and they proceeded together into the country. When they had got out of sight of the ship, the magician sat down, and taking from his vestband a small drum, began to beat upon it with 2 sticks, when instantly a whirlwind arose, and a thick column of dust rolled towards them from the desert. Mazen was alarmed, and began to repent having left the vessel. When the magician, seeing his color change, desired him to calm his apprehensions, for which there was no cause, that he had only to obey his orders and be happy. He had scarcely spoken when the wind ceased, the dust dispersed, and 3 camels stood before them, one of which was laden with water and provisions. The others were bridled and very richly caparisoned. Bahram, having mounted one, and at his desire Mazen the other, they travelled without ceasing, except to take the necessary refreshment and repose, for 7 days and nights successfully over a wild and sandy desert. On the 8th morning they reached a beautifully fertile tract, delightfully watered by clear streams, and the ground verdant, shaded by spreading trees laden with fruit, and on whose branches various birds warbled melodiously, and beneath them antelopes and other forest animals sported unmolested. At the end of a thick avenue rose to view a capacious dome of blue and green enamel, resting upon 4 columns of solid gold, each pillar exceeding in value the treasures of the sovereigns of Persia and Greece. They approached the dome, stopped their camels and dismounted, and turned the animals to graze. This splendid building was surrounded by a delightful garden, in which the now happy Mazen and the magician reposed themselves all that day and night. At some distance from this enchanting spot appeared a stupendous fabric, whose numerous turrets and lofty pinnacles glittered to the eye, and denoted a palace of uncommon magnificence, so that the curiosity of Mazen was raised, and he could not help inquiring of his companion to whom such a superb edifice might belong. The magician, rather roughly, desired him for the present to ask no questions concerning a place which belonged to his most bitter enemies, who were evil genii, and of whom, at the proper time, he would give him the history. Mazen was silent, but from the magician's manner he began to forebode some new treachery. In the morning Bahram beat his magical drum, and 3 camels appeared, when Mazen and his companion mounted, pursuing their journey in the same manner as before for 7 days, with a speed more resembling flight than the pace of travel, for their camels were supernatural. On the 8th morning the magician inquired of Mazen what he saw on the horizon. "I behold," said he, "to appearance a range of thick black clouds extending from east to west." "They are not clouds," replied Bahram, "but lofty mountains, called the Jubal al-Sohab, or mountains of clouds. From their cloud-like appearance, and on their summit, lies the object of our journey, which with thy assistance we shall soon obtain, and return to our vessel more enriched than all the sovereigns of the world. But thou must be sure to obey me in whatever I may command." Mazen promised to do so, but his heart trembled within him as he beheld the gloomy prospect before him, and recollected the boast which the accursed magician had made of his having sacrificed 39 youthful victims on these mountains, and also his threat on board the ship to make the 40th offering of himself. He repented of having trusted himself from the vessel, but it was now too late to recede. He resigned himself to the same Providence who had relieved his sufferings in his voyage, and concealed, as well as he could, his uneasiness from the magician, who now endeavored to soothe and flatter him with artful promises and caresses. For 4 days longer they pursued their route, when it was stopped by the Black Mountains, which formed, as it were, a wall inaccessible, for the precipices were perpendicular, as if scarped by art, and their tremendous height cast a dark and gloomy shade to a vast distance. They now dismounted and turned their camels to graze, when the magician took out of his package 3 loaves and a sum of water, after which he lighted a fire. Then, having beat his talismanic drum, the camels again appeared, the smallest of which he killed, emboweled, and carefully flayed off the skin, the inside of which he washed with water. Having done this, he addressed Mazen, saying, "My son, the task must now be thine, to crown our labors with success. Enter this skin with these loaves and this water bag for thy sustenance, while thou remainest on the summit of the mountain. Be not afraid, For no harm can happen, I will sew up the skin, leaving room enough for the admission of air. By and by a roc will descend, and seizing it in her talons, carry thee easily through the air. When she shall have alighted on the tableland of the mountain, rip open the stitches of the skin with thy dagger, and the roc, on seeing thee, will be instantly scared and fly far away. Then arise, gather as much as possible of a black dust which thou wilt find thickly strewed on the ground. Put it into this bag, and throw it down to me, after which I will contrive an easy means for thy descent, and when thou hast rejoined me, we will return to our vessel, and I will convey thee safely back to thy own country. The dust, which has the quality of transmuting metals into gold, we will share between us, and shall each have enough to rival all the treasures on earth." Mazen, finding it in vain to oppose, allowed himself to be sewn up in the camel's skin with the loaves and water, recommending himself by mental prayer to the protection of Allah and his prophet. The magician, having finished his work, retired to some distance, when, as he had said, a monstrous roc, darting from a craggy precipice, descended with the rapidity of lightning, grasped the skin in her widely extended talons, and soaring swifter than the eagle, soon alighted on the tableland of the mountain. When Mazen, feeling himself on the ground, ripped the stitches of his dangerous enclosure, and the roc, being alarmed, uttered a loud scream and flew away. Mazen now arose and walked upon the surface of the mountain, which he found covered with black dust. But he beheld also the skeletons of the young men whom the accursed Bahram, after they had served his purpose, had left to perish. His blood became chilled with horror at the view, and he apprehended the same unhappy fate. He, however, filled his bag with the black powder, and advanced to the edge of a precipice, from which he beheld the magician eagerly looking upwards to discover him. Mazen called out, and when the hypocrite saw him, he began dancing and capering for joy, at the same time exclaiming, "Welcome, welcome, my son, my best friend, beloved child, all our dangers are now over. Throw me down the bag." "I will not," said Mazen, "but will give it to thee when thou hast conveyed me safely from this perilous summit." "That is not in my power," answered Bahram. "Till I shall have the bag, cast it down, and I swear by the fire which I worship immediately to procure thee a safe descent." Mazen, relying on this oath, and seeing no other chance of escape, cast down the bag, which having taken up, the accursed sorcerer mounted his camel and was departing. The unhappy Mazen, in agony, called after him, saying, "Surely thou wilt not forfeit thy oath, nor leave me to perish." "Perish thou must, Mussulman dog," exclaimed the treacherous magician, "that my secret may be kept, nor can thy boasted prophet save thee from destruction, for around thee are mountains impassable, and below a fathomless sea. I have obtained what I wished, and leave thee to thy fate." Having said thus, he speeded onwards, and was soon out of sight. Mazen was now in an agony of despair. Not a ray of hope comforted his mind. He beat his bosom, threw himself on the ground amid the smoldering skeletons of the former victims to the treachery of the magician, and lay for some time in a state of insensibility. At length, the calls of hunger and thirst forced him back to a sense of wretched existence, and the love of life, however miserable, made him have recourse to his water and his loaves. Being somewhat revived, religion came to his aid, and he began to pray for resignation to submit to the decrees of heaven, however painful. He then walked to the edge of the mountain overhanging the sea, which he observed to wash the base of the rock without any beach, at sight of which a desperate chance of escape struck his mind. This was, to throw himself from the precipice into the ocean, in hopes, should he survive the fall and rise to the surface, he might reach land. He commended himself to God, and shut his eyes, held in his breath, and giving a desperate spring, plunged headlong into the dreadful abyss, which providentially received him unhurt, and a friendly wave drove him on shore. where, however, he remained some minutes in a lifeless stupor, owing to the rapidity of his descent from the brain-sickening precipice. When his senses returned, Mazen looked wildly around him, at first scarcely able to bear the light from the recollection of the dizzy eminence from which he had plunged, and an uneasy interval elapsed before he could persuade himself that the certainty of death was past. Convinced at length of this, he prostrated himself to the earth and exclaimed, "In God alone is our refuge and support. I thought I should have perished, but his providence has sustained me." He then wept exceedingly, entreated forgiveness of his offenses, read several passages from the Koran, which he had preserved in his vestband, repeated the whole of his rosary, and besought the intercession of the Prophet for his deliverance from future dangers. After this he walked onwards till evening, the fruits of the forest his food, his drink the water of the streams, and his resting place the green turf. Such was his progress, that after 3 days he reached the spot under the mountain where he had been taken up by the rock in the camel's skin. He now recognized the road he had come, and after measuring back his steps for 9 days, beheld on the last the superb palace, concerning which he had inquired of the magician, who had informed him it was inhabited by evil genii, his most bitter enemies. For some time Mazen hesitated whether he should advance to the gates of the palace, but considering that no greater calamity could happen to him than he had already endured, he contemned danger and boldly advanced to a grand lodge built of white marble, exquisitely polished. He entered, and beheld on one of the raised platforms which skirted the passage into the court 2 beautiful damsels playing at the game of chess, one of whom, on beholding him, exclaimed, "Surely, sister, this is the young man who passed this way about a month ago with Bahram the magician." "I am he," exclaimed Mazen, at the same time throwing himself at her feet, "and entreat your hospitable protection." The lady, raising him from the ground, said, "Stranger, you resemble so much a once beloved brother that I feel inclined to adopt thee as such, if my sister will also agree to do so." The other lady readily assented. They then embraced Mazen, seated him between them, and requested to be informed of his adventures, of which he gave them a true narration. When Mazen had concluded his story, the ladies expressed compassion for his misfortunes and the strongest resentment against the accursed magician, whom they vowed to punish by a tormenting death for having had the insolence to accuse them of being evil genii. They then proceeded to acquaint him with the cause of their residence in this secluded palace, saying, "Brother, for as such we shall henceforth regard you, our father is a most potent sultan of a race of good genii, who were converted by Solomon, the son of David, to the true faith. We are 7 daughters by the same mother, but for some cause which we do not know, the sultan our father, being fearful of our becoming connected with mankind, has placed us in this solitary spot. The palace was erected by genii for our accommodation. The meadows and forests around it are delightful, and we often amuse ourselves with field sports, there being plenty of every sort of game, as you must have observed. When we want horses or camels, we have only to beat a small magical drum, and they instantly attend our call, and ready caparisoned. Our 5 sisters are at present at the chase, but will soon return. Set thy heart at rest, forget thy misfortunes, which are now at an end, and thou shalt live with us in ease and pleasure." End of section 40.